Jenny not on there?
Yeah.
Not cooking enough. Wonder there's not left. Okay. I call to order the committee of the whole for 243 for Tuesday, April 25th. And in honor of the Leewat, the Village of Pemberton acknowledges that we are meeting within the unceded territory of the Leewat Nation. For those members of the public in attendance, please note that this meeting is a live webinar and is being recorded. A recording of the meeting will be available on the village's website following the meeting. Council member, myself and council members Nightingale, Ramsden and Craddock are here in person, and Councillor Helmer is joining us remotely. Any amendments to the agenda? Seeing none, move is presented. Councillor Craddock, second by Councillor Nightingale. Any opposed? Motion carries. 3.1 approval of the minutes from regular committee of the whole meeting 242 from April 18th. Moved by Craddock, second by Councillor Ramsden. Any opposed? Motion carries. That'll take us right to 4.1. We have to let some guests in here, I believe. Looking at 4.1, which is the introduction to housing needs report and opportunities for local government. Josephovic. Say your last name, Josephovic. That's very much. Good afternoon, Ms. Josephovic. How'd I do?
Not bad, Yosifovich.
Wow, we just met, but that's fine. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'll turn it over to you when you're ready to go. It was all yours.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, Mayor Richmond and Council. It's really nice to be here. I really appreciate that we're able to meet at least virtually and have the discussion we're about to have. My name is Marina Yosifovich, as you just introduced me. I'm a consultant with Urban Matters, and I'll share a little bit about my company in a second. But we have been working with the village to complete the community's housing needs report. So I've been involved over the last number of months looking at housing needs in the community. And through conversations with staff, we've really explored, what are the needs in the community, but we've started to explore what are potential opportunities and roles for the village. So a lot of the content that I'll be sharing today is drawing from those conversations. My background is I'm trained as a planner, and over the last number of years I've been specializing in housing, and my work focuses on affordable housing research and policy primarily for local government. So if you can just give me 1 second, I'm going to share my screen as I do have a bit of a PowerPoint presentation here. Okay. Can someone confirm that you can see my slides?
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. So just a little bit about Urban Matters, if you haven't heard from us about us before. We are a subsidiary of Urban Systems, so we're actually part of a larger planning and engineering family of practitioners. But we were set up as a community contribution company to work on with communities on complex social challenges like housing, as we're talking about today, through the key lenses of systems change, lived experience, and social and economic inclusion. And the reason we're separate is we actually have a bit of a unique business model as a community contribution company, recognizing we're kind of working on these sticky social and economic challenges. It built into our business model is a portion of our profits, 60%, actually go back into community to work on addressing some of these challenges. So it's just, I think it's just important context in terms of how we're set up. We do a wide variety of projects around social planning, housing, age-friendly communities, opioid response, quite a diverse range of projects around those complex social challenges. And we do things like research, developing strategies, and leading collaborative processes around those. that's just a little bit about us, but just kind of to ground us in the purpose of today's session. I'm here to share some information from my work as a housing planner on the roles of local government in housing and opportunities that are starting to emerge in conversations that the village may wish to explore. But my understanding coming in is that this is really a space for questions and discussion with council. So maybe I'll just actually ask for a little bit of direction here. I have a presentation. It'll take about 20 to 25 minutes to go straight through, but I'm also happy, and we could have a discussion at the end, but I'm also happy to be interrupted with questions and comments along the way. Do you have a preference for how we might proceed?
You know, I want to leave room because this is a big conversation. We'll have to keep control over it. So, you know, go through your presentation. If there are pressing questions from the committee throughout, we'll try to save them to the end, but if they're really relevant to the moment, then we'll allow for folks to jump in there if that works for everybody. So happy to hear your presentation.
Okay, that sounds really good. So just to kind of get started, so we've been doing this work on the housing needs report, and I know the purpose of today is to do a deep dive into that. We just shared our first draft with Colin and Scott on your staff team yesterday, so that project is well underway. And we just thought we'd share a few stats from that project just to as a bit of a foundation before we get into the bigger discussion around the role of local government in housing. Housing needs reports. So some of this information may be very familiar, but I also just do want to kind of share that the intent of housing needs reports is to identify current and future needs across the housing continuum for each community that has a housing needs report. And when I say across the housing continuum, we're not just looking at one type of housing, we're looking at rental, non-market ownership, and what are the different incomes in the community to look at what are the various housing forms that could serve the community as a whole. And so it also looks at identifying the types of housing and the affordability required to address housing needs. And then we also want to look at documenting the housing needs of different population groups, recognizing that the housing challenges don't impact people differently. And so that's also what we want to document to serve as a foundation for any future work the village does to work to address housing needs, that it's on a really strong foundation based on data and community input. Just the provincial context around these, you know, Pemberton isn't the only community developing a housing needs report. These are now legislated at the provincial level. And since 2019, the BC government has required local governments to complete these reports. Just the context is the province is widely recognized to be experiencing a housing crisis related to escalating costs and limited housing supply. And so the purposes of these housing needs are just one piece of the puzzle to help equip local governments with better information around what's going on locally. And I know Pemberton was one of the communities that had a housing needs report even before the legislation came in. But the purposes of this is to recognize that many communities didn't, and they didn't really have the data at their fingertips to inform their policies and plans. Housing needs reports legislatively must help inform OCPs and must be updated every 5 years. But there's other ways that they can be used that I just want to highlight. So many communities are using them to develop housing strategies, more targeted documents around addressing local housing needs. And so they can be used to by municipalities to complete those or to develop more specific housing policies. But they also are public documents. At the end of the process, they have to go on the municipal website, and they're intended to be used by the community as well. So it's not just municipalities, but local nonprofits, developers can also refer to these reports to understand what's going on around housing in the community. A bit about our process, just really quickly, there's kind of two big pieces of information we look at with housing needs reports. One is the quantitative data piece, looking at statistical information from, you know, census, from BC Housing on nonprofit housing supply, as well as looking at village development data. And the other big piece is hearing from the community. So we did targeted outreach to stakeholders, and then the OCP engagement process also had a focus on housing that we've drawn on as part of our housing needs report. So those two kind of big data sources help inform the housing needs results that we'll be preparing through our housing needs report. Just a few indicators, just around demographics and housing that we saw through this report. Between the 2016 and 2021 censuses, Pemberton saw some pretty interesting and dynamic demographic shifts that I just want to call attention to, because they really they have a big influence on housing. So we saw this big jump in population, 32% between the two census periods, and reflected also in new housing development in the community as well. So this real growth pressure that is going to influence housing demand, housing pressures in the community. We also see that the village has a relatively young population, especially compared to the provincial median. So at the bottom left graph here, you see the median ages for Pemberton, SLRD, and BC. That said, while the overall population is relatively young, Pemberton is also experiencing higher rates of growth among its older population. So over the last several census periods, the population of seniors 65 and over has doubled, for example. And so these dynamics are happening at the same time. The top right graph shows the distribution of household types in the community. And Pemberton is unique among many communities in BC, where you have this really high proportion of families with children. It's a very attractive community for families with children. And that stands out when we look at a comparison of the region as well. One of the most interesting things that I noticed in the data was about 20 to 25% of the population moves in a given year. And that might not necessarily be in and out, it can also be internally, but that reflects a population that's very much in flux. And I know that reflects some of the seasonal employment trends and all of these pieces that happen around employment and housing in the community. But we also see this we also see fluctuations in household sizes and compositions from census year to census year, which can also make it challenging to see the trends and respond in an adaptive way to community housing needs. So I just want to call attention to some of those pieces. When we look at housing in the community, as I mentioned, that the population flux also shows up in the housing figures. So for example, the proportion of renters and owners in the community shifts from census year to census year. In other communities, we see often a gradual change where the changes in Pemberton are a little bit more dramatic and not necessarily always in one direction. With the population growth between the 2016 and 2021 census, not only did the overall number of households increase, but we also saw the proportion of renters increase pretty dramatically by 2021. So that's a recent and interesting dynamic in the community. When we looked at the data, the kind of data that we look at, we often look at what are the main housing issues in the community. And primarily, like many communities in BC, housing unaffordability is the most significant issue facing Pemberton households, with 22% of owners and 32% of renter households spending more than 30% of their household income on shelter costs. And that 30% is the typical cutoff of affordability that we see, though that those dynamics have shifted as housing has become more and more unaffordable. But unlike other communities where we see high rates of unaffordability, Pemberton also has relatively low rates of core housing need, which indicate when households have a housing issue but can't afford to move in the community. So when a community has low rates of core housing need, it is a bit curious to me, and it makes me wonder, okay, what's going on? And so one of the things that we've been exploring is the issue is not only related to affordability, though that is a big part of it, but it's also related to supply and the choices that people have in terms of housing in the community. So there's some dynamics there. Pemberton, for a community of its size, also has a more diverse housing stock, which is notable. More infill and more gentle density through townhomes and secondary suites and lower rise apartments. And those have shifted over the last number of years with new development. I just want to highlight this. This is just very preliminary for the purposes of a short presentation. One of the things we do in the housing needs reports is affordability analysis. So we compare local incomes with housing costs. And the report goes into a lot more detail in terms of current housing costs and how these might be different. But one of the things that we did just as a simple check is look at median household income by owners on the left here and renters on the right, and median shelter costs for owners and renters based on census data. So it's not the most recent, for example, home sale prices or the most recent rents. It's just general median rents and home ownership costs in the community. And one of the things that through this analysis we can see very, very clearly is that there's certain households that face greater challenges around affordability than others. So the two that I just want to call attention to here are one-parent households. Typically make lower median incomes and face larger issues because they typically need larger units, which are more expensive, and non-census families, which refers to individuals who are not living in a family situation. So they could be living alone, which is most non-census families, or in a rooming situation. So you could see based on those income differences, those two households are facing the greatest affordability gap. Our report looks at affordability in a broader sense, and the escalating costs in Pemberton are affecting more households than just these two, but I just wanted to kind of give a bit of a sneak peek into the type of work that we're doing. So just to kind of revisit the intent, we're going to, when we finish the report, it will include the number of units needed to meet underlying and anticipated need over the next 5 years. It will identify anticipated tenure based on recent trends, so owners and renters. Anticipated affordability for rental, especially, it's very difficult to have goals around affordability for home ownership because it's so market driven. And the types, the number of bedrooms and the unit counts by number of bedrooms, recognizing trends in household type and where you're seeing growth in different households. In terms of next steps after a housing needs reports, we have been connecting with the team at the Village around alignment with the OCP and where this information is valuable for the OCP. The Village may consider identifying some actions to address these housing needs. So for example, I'm going to talk about housing strategy and what that entails. The Village may consider developing housing policies, for example, to help address these housing needs. And that might also be an outcome of the OCP work. And then there's ongoing monitoring in the 5-year update where the Village can kind of use the housing needs report to kind of check its work and see how trends are being met or where there might be some issues in terms of meeting community need. I know I've been talking very fast because I just wanted to provide that as a bit of an introduction. Maybe I'll stop just if there's any clarifying questions with any of the information I've shared before I move on.
Any questions at this point?
No.
I think that was pretty clear.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So just in terms of, a potential next step, one of the things that I was asked is just to share some information around what is a housing strategy. And, housing strategies, many communities have them, but I think sometimes it's helpful to look at why. So a housing strategy is a commitment by a local government to take action on housing. And it identifies the specific actions and policies that will be implemented to address the housing gaps in the community, including how you're going to prioritize those actions. And it'll also identify resources and other partners beyond just the municipality that are required to support this work. And so the reason I highlight this is that while a community can develop a housing strategy at any point, we typically see them when market dynamics haven't been able to provide or haven't been able to meet everyone's housing needs. So housing strategies emerge as an area of exploration and an action item when, the market alone is not able to provide for the community's housing needs. So they come into play when there's a problem, essentially, is kind of what I want to highlight. And so the opportunity with the housing strategy is to assess local opportunities very intentionally for where the Village may want to intervene and how those interventions, what kind of impact they might have through the analysis you might do for a housing strategy. It's an opportunity to identify very tangible actions and timelines for implementation. So staff, as well as the community, knows what's happening and when, to provide direction to staff and identify appropriate resources. And then there's also an opportunity through a housing strategy to communicate the Village's priorities to the housing sector, and not just the local housing sector, but to whether you're advocating to the province, for example, or you're advocating to federal government funding opportunities and all of those pieces. Okay. With that, I'm going to dive into the role of local government in housing. I'm sure there's a lot of questions and discussions around this. So I'll just share what we typically see in our work. So we work with communities across Western Canada, and there's some commonalities. And there's also some uniqueness and differences between communities that are very relevant. When it comes to responding to housing in a community and responding to housing affordability and supply challenges, there's different ways to think about them. The first is, so this is quite high level, but the first is looking at demand. So you can look at cooling demand, housing demand, and to stabilize prices. As long as you have high demand, you're going to have that pressure on the housing supply, and you're going to have pressure on costs. So sometimes we talk about, well, how can we reduce or cool housing demand? You can also, so that's at the broader system level, you can also influence how different households are able to demand housing. So for example, down payment assistance or rental subsidies support the ability of low-income households to demand housing in the community. They have more money to spend, so they have more leverage in the housing market. These are very valuable and very important things to consider when it comes to housing affordability and supply. But these are two areas, or housing demand in general is an area that local governments typically have very limited tools to respond to. Just because these often happen at, policies around these pieces often happen at a higher level, especially at the provincial and federal government level. Though potentially this is the topic of conversation, but typically what we see is that local governments have very few tools to manage overall demand in community while achieving some of their other goals, such as strong job growth and all of these other pieces. Where we see local governments typically focused on is around supply. And so most of the tools that local governments have is actually focused on responding to supply issues. And so this could be increasing or enabling new market supply, both market rental and market home ownership, increasing and enabling new non-market housing supply. So focusing on those low to moderate income households whose needs are not being met by the market, and working to preserve existing affordable housing. So protecting and expanding existing supply. It's within the housing system, local government's obviously not the only actor working in this. So we have this little bit of a graph that we often share as kind of just a key piece around looking at housing roles. Was there a question, or did I just mishear?
I don't think so.
Okay, I just misheard. So local government traditionally has been, the role of local government has traditionally been facilitating development through planning, regulations, and approvals, incentivizing development through various policies and financial incentives, educating around housing in the community, as well as advocating to various partners and governments around housing need in the community, and then working to create partnerships. So those are kind of four common and core roles of local government. In some cases, less commonly, local government has also gotten involved in building and operating housing. In BC, that's very unusual, but we have, Pemberton has the example of the Whistler Housing Authority really nearby, and that's an example of an exception to those general common roles. The province and the federal government are very actively involved, so they do have a role to play around planning, regulations, and approvals in areas that intersect with provincial and federal authority. But they also have a very big role to play around incentivizing development. So through the various funding programs that we've seen, through various financing programs, and educating and advocating at multiple levels around housing, and are very active in the partnership space as well. Provincial and federal, especially the province, also plays a role in building and operating housing, especially here in BC. We see that through BC Housing. Indigenous governments, typically for their members and those living within their reserve communities, can be involved in all these types of roles. They often play all of these roles in their communities, but they can also, as we're seeing more and more, partner with other levels of government and other actors in the system to build housing and to operate housing. The nonprofit sector is a key player when it comes to building lower cost and nonprofit housing, non-market housing. And this is typically non-market rental housing, but there's also examples of non-market or market restricted home ownership that we see nonprofits play a role in. And then obviously the private sector, most of our housing in Canada is built by the private sector and managed by the private sector. So they play a very pivotal role in the housing system. I want to kind of dive into some of the core housing tools that local governments have at their disposal. The first is facilitating housing, and that's through, I'm going to call it more, it's not just the soft skills of housing. It goes beyond that, but these are very vital roles, and they're sometimes less tangible, but supporting the creation of partnerships, building coalitions and building relationships with the key partners, communications and awareness around housing to all the actors in the system to be saying, this is the type of housing that we need. This is the role that we want these different actors to be playing, and coordinating among different actors in the system. The second is incentivizing. So one of the most important roles that we've seen local governments in recent years play, in addition, I'll get into a regulation, but local governments can't necessarily provide the very large subsidies that provincial and federal government can offer in terms of financial incentives, but they do have tools that can really spur the creation of needed housing forms. So through tools like density bonusing, grants and financial incentives, using tools like pre-zoning to make it easier for certain types of housing to develop, parking reductions, offering opportunities on municipally owned land. Not all of these are appropriate for every local government, but they're some of the key tools that we see local governments use to incentivize needed housing development. The third is...
If I might ask a question, if you don't mind.
Of course.
Under incentivize, you've got property tax reductions. Is that something new? Because under the community charter, we can't change property tax.
You might not be able to. So what we often see is grants to offset property taxes. So it can be implemented in different ways. So the local government can't eliminate property tax, but what we've seen other communities do is offer grants to reduce or offset property taxes as an incentive.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. The third is the regulation. And, this is kind of the core work of local government around housing and planning and development. And so through OCP designations, through zoning, municipalities can do a lot to enable different types of housing, more diverse housing forms, needed housing forms to be built in the community. Regulation can also go beyond these planning tools into enabling policies. So for example, creating an affordable housing reserve fund, for example, to help enable some things like, we had just talked about grants for property tax reduction. So that could be a policy introduction. Municipalities can also introduce things like tenant and rental protection policies to protect existing rental and to protect tenants in the system beyond what is provided, for example, at the provincial level through the Residential Tenancy Act. And finally, education. And so this could be preparing information materials for local property owners around what they can do with their properties. It could be sharing information with renters around supports that are available in the community. Municipalities can also fill knowledge gaps. So for example, doing studies like the Housing Needs Report. By sharing that information publicly, municipalities are filling knowledge gaps within the community, within the system of different actors that are involved in housing in the community. And then finally, under education is advocacy on behalf of the community to provincial and federal government. So just in terms of key housing concerns, this is in a nutshell, some of the things that we've heard through the Housing Needs Report. And not uncommonly in BC, these are kind of the key areas that municipalities are looking at. Well, how do we address these housing concerns through our plans and policies? Housing for people who work here, to make sure that there's that flexibility and availability in the system, that people who are working in the community can find housing and stay here. Housing for people to put down roots. Often all of these are interconnected, but sometimes they can also be different. So housing for people who want to stay here long-term, that maybe they're not here, maybe they come for a season for work and then they want to put down roots and stay here, whether it's to retire or to raise their family or whatever it may be. Housing for people to age in place. So a housing stock that is flexible and responsive enough that people can stay in their own community, the community that they've lived for a long time, even when they get older, and even as their abilities may change. And then housing for vulnerable individuals, recognizing that every community, has a diverse range of housing needs in the community. And so ensuring that there's the housing stock has, for example, supports in place so that people can stay in the community, that they're not forced to leave if they have a mental health issue or if they have a disability, or face other barriers in the housing system. As I mentioned, when we look at housing through a housing strategy or through a housing needs report, we use the lens of a housing continuum. Every community requires a diversity of housing, just recognizing that our needs change over time. You know, you may start as a renter, you may go into home ownership for part of your life, but as you get older, we're also seeing, long-term homeowners who are retired and they want a bit more flexibility and they want to downsize, and maybe rental starts to look more attractive if the options are there, or they want a smaller condominium, or maybe they require more assisted living options. And so the housing continuum is often presented linearly like this, and it can be interpreted as that if you go from you want to go from left to right, the right is always better. But actually people's lives are more complicated than that. And people jump across the housing continuum over their lifespan, depending on what they need. And I highlight that because it highlights the diversity of the housing that's required in a community. And no single type of housing will meet everyone's needs all the time. And so when we go into what can local governments do, I've talked about some of the roles. I'm going to get into some of the specific opportunity areas, but a few things that I want to highlight is what local governments can do is respond to community housing needs now and anticipated. The housing needs report will get into, what are the current underlying needs today based on who lives in the community, where are the pressures, but then also anticipated is looking at, okay, our community is growing. How do we keep up so that we can alleviate some of those pressures over time? Strategies need to be based on local context. So I've shared some of the key common roles or tools that local governments use, but they need to be adapted to the local context, right? You can't necessarily, it's not plug and play. We can't just copy paste from other communities. They have to be really developed for the local economic and land context and in the local community's needs. Something I highlight when we're looking at roles and actions for local governments is that they need to kind of be a balance of a number of things. It's not just, we're rarely operating in an ideal scenario. So you want to look at the desired impacts. What are you trying to change? And so that gives you a range of options for potential intervention. But then you also want to look at what is your staff capacity? What are your financial resources to implement a different intervention? What's the level of urgency? Because that will inform, how many resources and how much staff and all of those pieces that you might want to put to a challenge. And what are the potential partnerships? Recognizing that municipalities can't do everything alone. So who else can be involved to support this work? Some of the key barriers to building more needed housing and where these tools are responding to are common across many communities. And so I'm just going to highlight some of them, and some of the strategies that I'm going to be talking about later respond to these. So what we typically see when communities don't have, are having are experiencing housing pressures and struggling, especially to build the type of housing that they need or to create the housing stock that they need, is access to and cost of land. So as housing costs have escalated, so have land costs, and that's created a lot of barriers to building certain types of housing, especially lower cost housing. In many communities are dealing with the lack of partnerships between the right actors. And this is often just something that needs to be developed over time, especially if the history and the relationships aren't there. Those things take time and need to be put into place. Many communities don't have incentives for non-market and rental housing, or they may have them on an ad hoc basis, but they don't necessarily have a program around it. And this can be a limiting factor because it takes longer to put those things into place. And it's also the signals to the community housing sector aren't there to say, we want this type of housing, and here is what the village is bringing to the table. When it comes to nonprofits and even private sector actors, making the finances work is a very significant challenge, both on the capital and operating cost front. On the capital cost front, the cost of land and construction obviously have risen very, very significantly. So finding ways to make those work is one of the biggest reasons for looking at incentives. Incentives are not only signaling to the community housing sector, we need this type of housing. They're also offering opportunities to make the numbers work better when it comes to costs. One of the question around property tax grants, one of the reasons property taxes are often looked at is that they are an ongoing expense. And so when there's ways to offset them, it can help make the operating side more feasible, not just the capital. And then in some of the barriers that we're also seeing is policy environments that are encouraging high cost housing. So this is not necessarily intentional, it's often inadvertent, but many communities where very low density housing is prioritized or there's minimum lot sizes encourages the development of low density, larger homes. There may be a significant market for those homes, but within that context, it can be hard to build some of the smaller units, more affordable units that housing diversity that meets a range of needs in the community. So I just want to kind of highlight just a range of interventions, some common or not just common, some of the things that are generating the most conversation in many ways in BC. And I've put them on the scale a little bit just to highlight less direct interventions, lower effort interventions, and more direct, higher effort interventions. So on the left, we've talked about a number of these. These are policies and using regulatory and policy tools to enable the housing sector, to incentivize it, but then the housing is built by the private sector or the nonprofit sector. So this includes density bonusing, land use designations and zoning, pre-zoning, and offering financial incentives such as grants. And so in this way, the municipality is communicating, this is what we want, this is what we're willing to offer. And then it's the housing sector that picks that up and makes those projects happen. On the farthest right is the most active involvement. And I highlight this also intentionally because I know this has been a topic of conversation in the village in looking at the Whistler example. But the most direct and highest effort is actually entering the housing market through the creation of, for example, a housing authority, or another way is, the creation of a municipal land trust. There's different models that could be explored, but this is where municipalities are saying, the housing sector as it stands is not enough. We need to play a more active role to create the housing stock that we need and to protect it over the long term. And so, as I mentioned, there's very few examples of this in BC, but this is an area that more and more communities are at least starting to explore. There's a lot of work that needs to go into making it feasible, and we can talk about that. But this is definitely a topic of interest in BC at the moment. And then in the middle, I want to highlight some intermediary interventions that are more effort than just enabling, but not as directly involved. And so I had talked about facilitating partnerships, getting the right people at the table. The other is many municipalities have acquired or offered existing municipal land for lease for affordable housing, which I know not every municipality has land available to do that. There's the advocacy role to provincial and federal government. And then there's looking at things like administering an affordable rental or home ownership program, which we've seen some communities do, acting kind of as intermediaries to keep units affordable over the long term. Some of the highest opportunity areas that we see, again, this is one of the things that I should mention in sharing this, is these are things that we're seeing across the province. I'm intentionally not making direct recommendations for Pemberton. And the reason is there's so much work that you would want to do before you make direct recommendations. And I'm not in that position to do that. I'm responding to the housing needs that I'm seeing and the work I've done across BC around housing needs and housing strategies. And so these are ideas that are common in many communities. But when you develop a housing strategy or when you decide to take on any specific intervention, there's a lot of ground truthing that's needed from your community versus just me being able to say Pemberton should do this. I don't want to imply that that's the intent here. These are just some opportunity areas based on some commonalities in BC communities. In terms of high leverage areas based on creating that supply and affordability that we want to see. As I've mentioned, leveraging land, acquiring land for affordable housing development, offering incentives for needed housing types, and really communicating what those incentives are, tying benefits that are offered to the development sector, like density, to desired housing. And by desired housing, I mean the affordability you want or the type of housing you want, facilitating those partnerships. And I've talked a lot about federal and provincial government, but also other nonprofits, churches, large employers. There's a number of different ways partnerships can be created, enabling more housing diversity through infill, so leveraging trends that are already happening in the community, and creating policies that support long-term and affordable housing, such as tenant protection policies, rental replacement policies, rental use zoning, and other pieces like that. As I've mentioned, these tools need to be applied based on the local context. The same tools will look very different in implementation across communities. And I really highlight the need to leverage local strengths and what the community is already doing and interested in as part of identifying strategies. Many of these tools require significant economic analysis to really know their impact. And I highlight that because there is no one size fits all. Just because something worked in one community doesn't necessarily mean it'll work in another, because the development context, the land costs, is very different. So that's why we always look at, understanding the economics of any intervention. And then just as, a big piece is that in the housing system right now, there are no silver bullets. So most communities, every community that's, working on housing is looking at implementing multiple strategies, recognizing that it's important to come at the challenge from different lenses and from different angles. I just want to highlight, there are a number of opportunities at the moment. In the past, I've focused on housing. I've been a planner for longer, but I've been exclusively focused on housing for about 5 or 6 years now. And it's been really exciting over those years, going from very few resources at multiple levels of government being dedicated to housing. And now a number of resources are coming in, and we're a bit behind the 8 ball, to be frank. But it's really exciting that these opportunities are there. And I just want to highlight, because some of them may be relevant here for Pemberton. So CMHC has recently introduced a program called the Housing Accelerator Fund, which is specifically targeted towards local government, and putting in policies and actions that increase housing supply and affordability. So it's a very unique program, and it provides a lot of flexibility for local government in terms of what they can do with the money. Then there's a number of programs through CMHC around financing and grants and funding for different types of units types, especially non-market and market rental housing. BC Housing has been especially active on the capital funding side. So I won't go into all of these in details, but providing fairly generous per unit capital funding opportunities. And our understanding is that there may be an upcoming program call that local nonprofits may be interested in pursuing. So those are kind of the big opportunities that we're seeing on the landscape. So with that, I'll stop. I hope that was, I know that was a lot of information. I would very much welcome your questions or even your comments as it'll help me in my work in the housing needs report. So very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Marina. Great presentation. A lot of good information. Can you maybe speak a little bit more about housing authority versus housing society and how that might apply? We've had a bit of a conversation going on here locally about why a housing authority wouldn't be appropriate for a town like Pemberton. And then I've had some ensuing conversations with some other local mayors and about housing societies and how that might work. And one of my questions that I'm trying to dig at a little bit is, we don't have any, if any, and much of any land to bring forward as part of a housing authority and start building. We're not in that position. But a housing society that could help manage some of the needs and then maybe be a repository for some, like, to start building up a supply. Does a municipality, we're looking at projects that are coming to our table now one at a time. Hopefully through some zoning amendments and others, we're able to secure some affordable housing, non-market units, etc. At what point is a housing society helpful for a community like ours to start to manage that supply that starts to build, as opposed to trying to set up housing agreements and having those housing agreements managed by either nonprofits or by private sector? At what point do you feel, in your experience, it's appropriate for a town of our size with this growth to start looking at a housing society for those reasons?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think for me, my first question would be what is the current nonprofit housing landscape? Are there existing organizations that could potentially support that role? I think that where that is lacking, that's a clear opportunity for a municipality to explore. Okay, that might be an intervention point for us. We actually don't have the local organizations or the local capacity to do this work. So that would be my first question: is there an organization already working in the community that could potentially be supported and expanded? If that isn't the case, then you might look at potentially creating a local organization, or whether it's instigated by the local government or facilitated by the local government. I also just want to call attention, and this may not be desirable, but there may also be an opportunity to look at nonprofits working in nearby communities who may be interested in expanding their operations. The reason being that they already have resources and a backbone. They already have, leadership. They already have staff, so it can be easier to scale. But that's not always possible. So for me, the key gap would be: is there anyone who could play this role? If not, that's where you may look at creating or facilitating the creation of a housing society.
Okay, thank you. We got lots of follow-up thoughts, but I'll open it. Go ahead.
I just noticed on that housing continuum slide, the last two items, there was affordable housing and then non-market housing. So I guess I'm a bit confused then about the definition of what affordable housing is and trying to be clear about how it's being used, because my understanding is affordable housing is an individual doesn't spend more than 30% of their gross income on housing. So, but that slide suggests that affordable housing is not non-market housing versus. So is that saying that we don't consider affordable housing market housing?
So I apologize for that confusion. So I use that graphic just because it's very common. It's not necessarily what I'm looking at for the Pemberton Housing Needs Report. It's a good question. Maybe if I can provide just some clarity. Typically what we see at the farthest right is market home ownership, and then market rental below that. And then below market rental, we would have non-market housing, which it can actually be at a wide range of affordability levels. You can have non-market housing from anything from, shelter rate, $375 a month for people on income assistance, to almost at market, but just a little bit more restricted. So it's a very broad category. And then when it comes, so that's the housing continuum in different tenure and affordability types. But one of the things I want to add to that is that you had commented on, the definition of affordability is 30% of household income. That could theoretically happen at any part of the housing continuum. There's people who own their home who spend 30% or less. So that alone, it just describes whether a household is spending an affordable amount. When we want to operationalize that into the housing continuum and where people fit, what we're looking at is for different income levels, what kind of tenure and housing types can offer that level of affordability. So for certain income levels, it can be market housing. And for certain income levels, the market isn't providing that. So we're looking at non-market housing options. So there's definitely a lot of confusion around those terms, but I hope that clarifies things.
Yes, thank you.
Questions? Maria, do you know if the HAF is going to be an ongoing thing, or is your sense in your world that this is a one-off?
I don't think we know yet. I think it'll be really interesting to see how it unfolds. I think the federal government will be monitoring, what the results are from the program before we know more about whether it'll be ongoing.
I just noticed that a lot of the strategies that are being looked at or being used commonly, a lot of them seem to be focused primarily on supply, which I understand is a big issue. But I was just wondering, are options, is there any discussions happening around demand and looking at demand and figuring out is there also an issue on the demand side that we need to be addressing? And I understand that municipalities have limited capacity, but whether it's at the municipal level or also provincial and federal,
Yeah, it's a tricky challenge because demand comes from a wide variety of sources. There's demand from just natural population growth. My understanding is BC is not actually adding too many households just through natural population growth. There's demand through immigration, which are set at the federal government level. The province has a role to play there. But municipalities don't necessarily have influence on those two big, that's a really, really big lever. And then housing isn't just a home. It's also, there's demand from people seeking investment opportunities. And so that demand is also tied up into housing costs. The more housing costs increase, the more incentive there are for homes as investment vehicles. So demand comes from a wide variety of ways. I think one of the things, this is a supply intervention, but removing some aspect of that demand. So for example, many communities are looking at more non-market solutions or market restricted solutions because they take away that demand from investors or people looking for, housing appreciation. And so that's one tool that local governments have, but there are very limited tools around those bigger issues around population growth and immigration. And I guess just another thing is it's also related to the local economy and dynamics. So, we've had a lot of conversations with the team as part of the Housing Needs Report that Pemberton is a very attractive place to live. So as long as it stays attractive, you're going to have high demand. And so the trade-offs of shifting that dynamic, there's other trade-offs that happen with trying to cool interest in people moving into the community, right?
Questions? Yeah, and maybe that's not the right place, but I'll ask it anyway. Do you have a sense for, and this one's coming to you guys later, for how the new provincial regulations around density and zoning are going to affect some of the work that you've presented here, and our team is doing in terms of imposing zoning, like fourplexes and all that sort of thing. Yeah, I'm just trying to wrap my head around what we're looking at here at our level and how much it's going to affect us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's still a lot of uncertainty and decisions that need to be made at the provincial level. There could be, you know, some imposition from the provincial level. The question will be whether it's already aligned with things that the village is already doing or intending to do. There might be more resources. This is still an area that's a little bit unclear to me, but, you know, with requiring up to 4 units on a lot, for example, there's a number of things that would need to change within local government policy and regulations. And so is the province going to provide resources to help facilitate that? So there could be potentially some opportunities there, especially if they're tied into things that the village is already looking at. But then it also might push the village in other municipalities, not just the village, depending on what decisions are made, into you know, taking certain directions that may or may not be aligned with what you were hoping to do anyway.
And do we have a sense of implementation timelines on some of this stuff? I mean, we're looking at whole new neighborhoods and developments that are coming our way that we have some big discussions to have around them. Some of those discussions might end up being moot. You know, I talked to a couple of planners a couple of weeks ago, and then they said, you know, reference to a specific project. We've stopped working on this specific master plan because it sounds like the province is going to write it for us, or, you know, somewhat tongue in cheek. But point being, you know, as we're looking ahead to some major development areas, you know, this is going to figure in properly. So do you have any sense of the timeline? When we're going to
I can only speculate right now, but I'm using the housing needs report legislation as like a reference point. I don't know if it'll be the same, but the province allowed 3 years to implement the housing needs report. So I assume there will be a phase-in period, but I'm just speculating at this point.
No, that's helpful. Thank you. I didn't expect that. Go ahead, Councillor Ramsey.
So just kind of a follow-up question. I understand that on the demand side, not talking about immigration or natural population growth, but I think you mentioned that a few communities had, I guess there's some measures that they looked into try and curb, I guess I would call it investor demand. And so I was wondering if I did interpret that correctly, if you have any concrete examples of what they did to do that, as well as you mentioned that there was some communities have used grants as a means to offset property taxes, roughly speaking. I was just wondering, again, if you might be able to, if you have any details or specific examples of how that was done, because I'm just curious what those mechanisms might look like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what I meant by communities looking at it, it's not reducing demand, but it's redirecting it is really what it looks like. And any time you create, for example, rental supply or non-market rental supply, you are you know, those folks who need housing and are living in the community have more options. And it's like the demand for investors or for whatever demand you're trying to manage is more directed into home ownership. So it's just redirecting it so that there's this protected supply that isn't necessarily being influenced by the demand that's driving up costs. So it's really related to supply, and it's creating supply that is more likely to be used by those that are living and working in the community, if that makes sense. And
yes.
That is more likely to be used by folks who have lower or more moderate incomes and that are based on local incomes. And in terms of grants, there's a number of different examples. And, you know, when we look at property tax exemptions, they're often part of packages, incentives packages that communities will put together. And there's different ways that you can do this. And I had shared a number of different incentives, but often what we'll see communities do, and I'm also happy to share a few examples with Colin and Scott, but they'll create kind of a housing incentives packages that provide different levels of incentives based on the type of housing that a community is wanting. So for example, we rarely see tax incentives, property tax exemptions for market housing. But we often see municipalities explore those tools when they really need more non-market rental housing. But it typically won't be just property tax exemptions. They may layer on, a grant for DCC reductions. They may layer on additional densities to make the project more financially feasible, as well as parking reductions. So it's rarely just one tool that's effective. It's looking at a package of tools, and more incentives are needed the greater affordability that you want to achieve. If you're looking at market rental, you might need some incentives, for example, density for market rental or market housing options, but you don't necessarily want to be directing a lot of financial resources because those resources are more needed at the lower cost housing side of things.
Thank you.
Questions? That's good. Okay, well, that was very informative. Thank you very much for your time and for the presentation. That was super helpful. Yeah, and I think we got a lot to chew on, a lot to think about here. So much appreciated. Thanks for joining us today, Marina. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Follow-up comment too, at the regional district the other day when we were talking about the housing, this is what I referenced earlier. Conversation came up about a regional housing authority or regional housing society, and this was tabled, I'm gonna say 9-10 years ago. I know Nancy was Mayor Whistler at the time, or I guess call it 8-9 years ago, when we had a bit of a forum or a gathering with CAOs, housing type staff, and elected about housing in the whole corridor. And at the time, the idea of a regional housing authority / society was floated, and it got shot down at the time. And it's come up every now and again at the board, but the feeling at the board table now is, things have changed. Maybe it's time to look at that again. Because I was saying to the group that sort of what I was asking Marina about, going, Pemberton's in a funny spot. We don't have a lot of land to bring forward, to build, so we don't really need a housing authority. On the other hand, as we start to look at all these different developments that might result in a handful of affordable units here or whatever, at what point do we start managing those centrally, as opposed to, CS Community Services is going to manage Harrow Road. These 10 units over at, and I'm just making stuff up now, Parkside are going to be managed by these 10 units over here. So how do we bring these, centralize this so that we're being most effective? If you have a housing society, you also have the ability to, it's a tool to say to developers, as part of the negotiation through your zoning amendment, X amount of units to be affordable on market, and they go into that pool. And now that ownership actually belongs to the society. So the society now has leverage over that capital, which allows you to start building more capital and more land if that's, land, talk about land assembly. So that gives you some leverage, some capital leverage to be able to do that. So there's some interesting bonuses to be considered down the road. I don't know if we're quite at that point, but again, as we start to look at perhaps collecting a number of small pockets of units, how do we decide how we want to manage those in an effective way that, again, we can most leverage it? I think is a really important question for us to explore. And then if it's not appropriate here in town, what does that bigger regional authority or society look like, and how does that work? And I don't know. What was proposed through the conversation at the regional district the other day when we were batting this around was to reinitiate another housing forum similar to the one we had 8-10 years ago, to bring elected and staff together, to bring folks from WHA, the Worcester Housing Authority, the newly formed Housing Society in Squamish, et cetera, bring them all together with all of our community and collective knowledge, and really start having a bit of a breakout talk about it. So that was discussed. I think we're going to see a little traction there. We were trying to figure out who it sits with in terms of making that invitation. So it's getting sorted out a little bit, but I feel like we're gonna be headed in that direction shortly. And again, that might allow us to explore a little more what a society potentially could look like for Village Park.
I think it might also be worth noting that if I understood correctly from the housing summit, provincial government did talk about some potential taxation reforms down the road, potentially property taxes too, and then that might also, if they do go forward with that, might also give municipalities more in their toolbox, because I think there was a recognition that property classes that was developed decades ago and that the landscape has dramatically changed. And, you've got properties that somebody's living in a house and is living next door to a house that is being used purely for commercial purposes through short-term rentals. Whereas property tax, it doesn't make sense that the property tax would still be the same. And so that, just as an example, I think that's also something that is maybe being discussed at the provincial level. Not that we can do anything about it, but it's, I don't know, it's nice to know that there's a discussion at least going on in that, because it would give us more tools.
I should ask Marina, but when we expect to see the housing needs assessment?
Yeah, the tentative target is the June 20th.
Oh, so because that'll help, I think, inform a lot of these conversations. And again, I'm interested in our staff's opinions about the fact that we have applications coming forward that could lead us to some affordable units, if not buildings, but units. So, how do we manage that? And how do we encourage, how does that society potentially support, let's say, the Lions, in terms of getting the next phase of the Lions fill out up and running, as opposed to having staff here. Interesting conversation. Anything else from anybody? Good enough? Okay, that takes us to 5.1 then. Appropriately be about the Fisherman and Community Plan zoning amendment application. Pemberton Farm Road East. Parkside.
Good temperature.
Yeah, get some stuff in
I
here.
know.
It's all yours when you're ready, Colin.
Can everyone see the presentation? Okay, good afternoon. So this is really an introductory report for committee of the whole to consider the OCP and zoning amendment application for the 7362 Pemberton Farm Road East that we refer to as Parkside. So we had a brief introduction back in December when we considered the consultation. This will go into a little bit more depth on what the application is about. The property is located east of Pemberton Farm Road and just south of the Dundas Park recreation site. Images here give you a little bit of context. The application is to create a 35 lot subdivision comprised of 34 small single family lots and one commercial lot. The residential lots range from a size of 300 square meters to just under 1,000 square meters.
Sorry to jump in, just as a reference point, what's an average lot in like the Glen size?
60 by 40 by 60, something like that.
Meters or feet? Yeah. I feet, so.
Yeah, so on the next slide has the subdivision plan on it, so we'll go there. So the access to this property off of Highway 99 to Sabre Way, which is underdeveloped road that accesses this site. It's a brownfield site, so that means that it was a former rock quarry, and has been highly disturbed, and it's not really doesn't have any of its natural vegetation left on it. It was formerly in the agricultural land reserve, excluded in 2013. This was we believe that it was actually an error that it was allowed to be a rock quarry at the time. So be it. The current zoning is for resource management, again, going back to the rock quarry. And so the zoning is required to be amended to allow the residential and commercial uses. Zoning must be consistent with the official community plan. So we go to their land use designation. It doesn't have a designation, and this is a legacy of when this land was brought in from the regional district a number of years ago. It is part of the Hillside Special Planning Area, and we'll get into more detail on that in a minute. And again, the zoning must be consistent. So here's our site plan. So most of these lots are around 500 square meters. And so the purpose is that they'd be the small lots, so effectively following into a zone that we already have called R2. We actually don't have any properties zoned in this lot. So most of these are laid out to comply with that. You've got lot 35 on the corner, which is the commercial site, and is will be a significant feature at this corner that looks right on right at the rec site. It's proposed to be a strata, so the road would be a private road, built not quite to municipal standards. Here's a rendering provided by the applicants of what buildings could look like when the property is built out. So in the report, we went through a review of the current plans and policies, starting with the regional growth strategy. I pulled out the highlights here, the ones that are most relevant to what's proposed here. Goal 1, talking about the quality of life and creating livable communities, and goal 3 about the provision of quality affordable housing. This gets linked to our own OCP through the context statement. Again, talking about these of our urban growth boundary and our support for compact development. In this case, there's a specific statement for this lot, parcels 7 in the context statement that talks about how the use of this property could contribute to the neighborhood, tying it together as a node. Further policies and directions talk about growth management and building on this with smart growth principles. All about, again, these compact communities, the mixing of uses, and creating center points for the community. And then the provision of livable and affordable housing stock. So to our OCP maps, so that this property is located in the urban growth boundary, but as mentioned, it currently doesn't have its own designation, and it is required in this hillside area to have an OCP amendment done before development can proceed. So the hillside planning area had a study done in 2011 that looked more into the development potential and the conditions of the site. And it builds on these other documents about developing a satellite neighborhood separate from the main community of Pemberton. But it's opportunity and it gives direction to create a well-designed and compact neighborhood. And so we'll go into why this particular lot is important here in a few minutes. Our climate action plan, again, built on the concepts of compact growth and infill development. And the benefits of that is the added densities give us better support for transit a commercial node and protects green space, all of things that will help this particular neighborhood into the future. The age-friendly housing action plan from 2019 has a number of goals and objectives. And then I've highlighted several of the strategic directions that could play a role in how we develop the housing mix for this one, whether it's various housing types and then the tools that we use to secure that mix as we go forward. So consultation, so that this was the list of referrals that was approved back in December. So letters were sent to all, not all responded, but significant responses were obtained. So Little Rock Nation did decide to table this referral at the referral committee and send back a letter noting that that they would like to see this as part of the ongoing OCP review, and that decided not to comment on this application further. The SLRD sent back a number of comments on affordable housing and links to the growth strategy. The ALC and the school district responded with no concerns or objections. And then the Dyking district, they provided a number of comments, most of it will be addressed through the building stages later on in the process if we get that far. Ministry of Transportation, that they have no objection at this time. They do get another say after third reading with this property located near Highway 99. So under the Transportation Act, that they do get another go at this one. Again, BC Hydro comments for the developer for later in the process, and then comments from village staff. Again, highlighting the potential for some affordable housing options at the site, and the idea of developing a walkable community. Further consultation. So the applicants held 2 public information meetings with the results coded into a number of categories. There's a number of comments debating the merits of single family housing versus looking at more affordable options and different options for the site. Several comments address issues for the layout and creating connections to the recreation complex. There are some comments on the commercial components and what that might look like. Parking is always a topic that comes up when we're debating whether or not to add more density or not to an area. Closely linked to traffic issues that may come up. And then further comments on the amenity contributions and how this development could work on developing that site further. And then the applicant provided a number of responses and answers with response to some of these comments. So all of this information, the referrals, the application, everything was brought to the Advisory Land Use Committee a couple of weeks ago. They had a great conversation debating all the issues that have been raised, and they did come up with a recommendation. All of this information covered in the report. And so finally, further discussion. So after all this, the application is generally consistent with the OCP, but with some exceptions where there were some there's a greater opportunity to explore the housing mix and how this contributes to the neighborhood. So the comments that we receive reflects that again that need to consider the housing mix beyond single family homes. There's opportunities for the area development and enhancing Gandalf Park and the neighborhood connections to that. Yes, there are concerns over density, traffic and parking, but it's something that needs to be weighed. What the housing mix and what the housing density needs to be for this site to work the best for this community. So adding this map, this subject property is lot C on this map. So this is this area, the hillside that's within the urban growth boundary. And I want to just highlight that if the goal is the compact and then community, one that really works centered around the Duff Park rec site, this site and the ones immediately around it are so important to get right. Because these are the ones that are going to support that node, so that park and the amenities that are there the best they can be. And so then we get to the options that are in your report. I believe they might be presented in different options. So whether the committee wants to consider the application as it was originally presented, staff recommendations, which are pull in a lot of the different comments and responses that we've heard. And then if you want to go off the board and go add or subtract or whatnot, can do that as well. With that, I'll ask for questions.
Thank you. Questions? Councilor Robinson.
From the meeting that we're both at, parking became the biggest concern as usual.
Yeah.
But I see there's some suggestion in your plan, or suggested in the plan, not your plan,
Yeah.
to go to 4 plexes, which all of a sudden decreases the amount, again, of green space on the lot, or even multiple over top of that. So how do we address that issue?
Yeah, through the chair, it certainly is a challenge. The way that the proposed subdivision is laid out, we do have some more lot width to deal with, or to work with in terms of how that access works, and maybe could accommodate more parking that way. You're right. If we do up the density, maybe it's added lot coverage, maybe there is less landscaping. Right, but it's all that balancing. Okay, do we need the housing units? Do we need consider the cars or landscaping and what one's out in the end?
Well, and I guess with Duff Park eventually expanding, there'll be different areas for the kids and families to recreate down there.
Yeah.
It just, I hate to see a subdivision basically become a parking lot.
Yeah.
And that's my concern. The streets are gonna be paved, and then trying to put 8 vehicles on the front of the lot, that's gonna be paved or some type of stuff. So that was one of my concerns. Thank you.
I just want to pick up on Councillor Caddick's point there. It's referenced, I think, in one of the SLRD comments as well, but I was considering, one of the things that was on my mind was the fact that it was all single family homes. Again, searching for a little more diversity in there. And then also the proposal where they would take up a good chunk of a small lot of space to connect some of them into townhouses or perhaps some other creative design. I'm not a designer, but to connect them and create that density that actually saves lot space and allows for more parking and green space. So by connecting, and this is just one suggestion, it could be way off, but by connecting 2 small houses or 3 small homes into a townhouse, you've created more room on the lot for parking and for green space. So I'm just wondering about consideration of that.
Yeah, just response. That's something that could be a consideration. For example, if we were to allow up to 4 units, they may not be in 4 different buildings, or a larger building, maybe they're smaller units. Some of them are smaller units, right? There's ways to manage how it sits and how this lot is organized.
It's changed out, but it accommodates parking a little to some degree, parking is a green space to some degree potentially, and there's creative designs in terms of those fourplexes now, it's not necessarily a box.
Yeah.
And I got Councillor Randall, Councillor Mayfield.
So I have a multitude of questions on a variety of different topics, so is the best way I'll just ask one.
Let's start a couple and then.
Yeah, okay, because I don't want to dominate the conversation. So I guess the first question is just, there's mention about affordable housing. So I want to be clear when we're talking about affordable housing, what do we mean by that? Are we talking about subsidized housing? Are we like, how are we making it affordable, i.e. 30% and less?
Yeah, so for that question, we haven't necessarily said what are the definition of affordable is. It may be something that's more affordable, whether you're adding more units to the lot. So yeah, you have more rental supply, or maybe they are smaller units. And it becomes more affordable that way for renters. It could also be for the property owner too, who now has potential 1, 2, or 3 mortgage helpers that helps that side of it as well. It's not necessarily the 30%, right? It's something that if the committee of council wants to look at something like that, we could look at that with the applicants.
I just add to that, the village's age-friendly affordable housing action plan does have a definition of affordable housing in it. And it's actually a very broad definition. So it's more of a trying to include, all the housing types that we would like to see, or at least at the time of that report's authoring, it was thought to be contributing to more affordable housing landscape. And so purpose-built rental housing is counted as affordable housing in that report. So staff kind of use that definition generally as a working definition when we talk about affordable housing. So it does include, market rental, which is sort of a strange dynamic, but seen through that lens of being a desirable housing form at the time of that report's authoring, it makes sense.
And I think also on that point, we look at some of these single family homes that don't have lock-off suites on them, is this something that council wants to see so that we're providing or rental suites, as well as a percentage of actual affordable non-market units? Like, it's not one thing, it's what council wants to see potentially and can work with the developer to get, but it could be a number of things. So I personally would like to see some more suites added to this, as well as some higher density, more affordable non-market sort of thing. So I think there's a lot to it.
Yeah, because I guess that was my concern. It's just like, if this is going to be a lack of a better word, selling feature of this project that, could potentially have affordable, I think as we get further along, I would want to see some details on what that looks like, whether it's, purpose-built rentals, however it is, it's just so that we do actually end up with affordable housing stock, and we're not just hoping that by adding more supply that rental prices are going to come down, because I think historically we've seen that hasn't been the case. So I just wanted to flag that as a concern. And then I guess my other question, just briefly on this, would be that ties in with this idea of affordability. So it looks like even if we went with the single family dwelling homes, this would be strata. This whole subdivision would be controlled by strata. And so I guess my question, if we're talking about, I guess my question is why it would be strata, why it wouldn't just be freehold.
Yeah, so in terms of answer that, I believe that our applicants are online, potentially available to answer this. We've had this question before, so the reason to be strata rather than fee simple, it is the municipal standards for road width and different things create more challenges for the site to fit in the proposed subdivision. And so there would be so I believe that's the rationale for their rationale for proposing strata versus fee simple. That they might be able to provide more context for that.
Okay, are you satisfied with that, or do you want me need to go to the applicant?
I think I would like a little bit more information, because I understand, okay, yeah, create some restrictions on lot sizes, but then, I mean, there's got to be a rationale for why the municipality requires streets to be a certain size and why stratas are allowed. And I understand that I do understand that it means, you know, we're not responsible for plowing those roads and things like that. But I guess my concern is again around affordability. You look at townhouses in here, an $860,000 townhome with the current mortgage rates, and then you add $300 a month for strata, and it just like it's all those things that over time. I mean, if we are looking at single family dwelling homes, one of the ideas is, you know, that you're not supposed to have to pay strata, and if they are supposed to be affordable, but now you're tacking on hundreds of dollars every month. Does that reconcile, I guess?
Do strata fees change with the affordable housing units within developments, or is that something that could be written in the housing agreement, or how does that?
That's something that I would have to explore more. I think most of that applies to the Strata Property Act, and so I'm not sure what the local government has to influence that.
And then we get good question to follow up, because like Councilor was saying, if you're adding $300-400 in data fees to an affordable unit, that's not necessarily.
Just so you know, the strata fee overrides municipal. So whatever the strata sets, we can't.
Yeah.
Unless negotiating an advanced agreement. Like we could, anyway, let's leave that, that's good information, thank you. I'm gonna take a break here, Councilor, and go to Councilor Nightingale and then Councilor Helmer.
Thank you. I'm just gonna ask you to pull back for a minute, just because I really appreciated that you showed the map with all the development areas and acknowledge that we've got to get it right, because it is going to be such a dense area when all is said and done. And then what I'm curious about is in the letter from the SLRD, they said that when the parcel of land was in the electoral area C, the OCP called for a sub-area plan to be created. And then when it was transferred to the village, that sub-area plan didn't happen for whatever reasons. But what concerns me is, and this is prompted by the detail and depth and I guess incredible thought that's going into the benchlands in terms of an overarching huge vision for that space. And what I'm concerned about here is that if we do a bit here and a bit here and a bit there, things like the importance of green space and community gardens and all those things aren't as a whole entire concept and vision being incorporated at the same time. And there was comments from some of the Sunstone residents saying that, you know, where do we walk our dogs? Where are all the people going to hang out? You can't have a picnic on a soccer field, for example, you know? And so that's what I'm saying. I'm pulling back and I'm looking to the future and I'm imagining that whole space, and I feel uncomfortable looking at a tiny piece, not knowing what the entire vision is. Do you understand?
Yeah, no, just with response to that, it is a challenge for this area. You've got a number of components, if you include the plateau, the ridge, Sunstone, this lot, the one on the other side, lot A, you've got the redwoods nearby as well. That there isn't the framework that sub-area plan would have for that. And yeah, so we can't go back, right? So start and have that. So it does create some challenges, because now you've got these different pieces offering different things, and how do we make sense of it all? And there are all such critical decisions for that space, and so. Yeah, if we really want the rec site to be that center of that whole node, yeah, it's something to consider on each of them, and it's tough.
I appreciate that, because the word we keep using is neighborhood, and the neighborhood concept plan for the benchland was really obvious that they're trying to create a meaningful and deep neighborhood for all members of the community. And so I'm just, this is out of ignorance, but you say we can't go back. is visioning not possible now? Like, I guess, is that, I don't know how this works. Sorry.
Yeah, it would create a much larger project to do that. There's different dynamics than what exists for the Nicoop suburban plan. And one of them is that people live there already. Right, there's people on the hillside. And so to go bring in a new framework for everyone. It is something that if council chose to go that route is something that we certainly can explore. But it's by no means a small or simple process.
I completely hear that, and I'm also hearing your words, is we got to get it right, and that's echoing for me. And the thought of there's already issues with people not knowing where to go with their dogs and things like that right now, and so is that going to just get more problematic? So I'm just pointing it out.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good observation, and maybe just to pick up on it real quick too, like Mr. Brown said, to go back to the beginning, we can't do, there's already people living there, this is a different dynamic from the bench land. Having said that, and to go back and try to create a whole new framework, I see the challenges in that. But when we look at things like, it's one of my notes on here about the commercial space, we're talking about compact neighborhoods and keeping people from driving unnecessarily. Do we look at commercial space for the whole area as opposed to, okay, they're going to have X amount of square feet and then maybe Redwood or maybe they will. And did we just create a compact neighborhood in doing so? You can say, can be said for, collective green space or gathering space or that sort of thing. So I don't know that we can or want to go back in time and try to revision the whole hillside there. But I think we could pull out some elements that we would like to see preserved or enhanced or considered for that whole neighborhood. That maybe we can look at holistically, again, commercial space, green space, whatever points. So I'm wondering, to Councilor Nightingale's question, can't do the original neighborhood concept plan. Is there a way for us to look at some of these aspects as a whole? Yeah.
I think there could be an opportunity to do that. I get it. It's a balance of we've got applications in front of us, right? Do we keep going with those? Do we decide we need to look at this more holistically? It's been done before where existing areas went and got a neighborhood plan or a sub-area plan. It's just how big a scope of a project do we want to potentially initiate, right? If we're to go that route.
No, I agree, and we'd have to be focused, which would be hard to do, but focusing, what are we talking about here? Again, is it a green space, is it commercial space, whatever, we've had very similar conversations in regional district when we look at all the development down Britannia, Furry Creek and all that. Okay, well, who's providing fire protection? And is it one little fire department in each neighborhood? What is individual? So I wouldn't, again, want to throw, I don't think the capacity, or we would want to personally go down the route of revisioning a whole sub-area plan for the area. But I feel like there could be a few elements of interest to council that we do want to ensure are met throughout the whole hillside area. So that's, I don't want to speak that, if that makes sense.
That makes complete sense, because I think that if we go back to the one of the directives, getting people out of their cars, we want people to stay there. And so we want all the amenities there that will encourage them to stay there. And that is a little bit of commercial. It is definitely green space for all people. It is, and our OCP, and even in the new consultation with the OCP, community gardens has been very significant in people and top of mind for people. And so all those things that keep people in a neighborhood, I feel need to be considered along with the type of housing that's going to be there.
Councillor Helmer, I'll finally go to you.
Thank you. My comments are really in line with what's been said already. I think the green space piece, I think, is fundamentally just so important to that entire area. And looking at the plan for this one little piece, there's nothing in there. And, you know, it is only one component of the larger picture. But when you look at the larger picture and the work that's been done to date, you know, are we happy with that? Are we comfortable with that? The feedback I get and the feedback I feel when I go out there is that there is no green space. There are no trees left. There are very few areas for children to play. As Councillor Nightingale pointed out, there are very few areas to walk your dog. And you know, at some point we really have to take into consideration the balance between providing housing density and providing the quality of life that we know we need to provide. And the piece that sort of ties into that I think was already mentioned by Laura was just because we increase density, it doesn't mean that the prices come down. And I think that's what we've seen so very strongly in Pemberton. So I do see all of those pieces so tied together that if we agree to increase density, we have to be really clear about why we're doing it and what the savings are to the buyer, not just that we're providing more housing to go on the market or more rentals, but the rental cost doesn't actually come down, but also that we're providing the requisite recreation space to go with that, because that entire region is really missing the quality of life component. And I think, you know, it is our duty to make sure that when we plan for regions and areas, that those pieces are considered heavily. And I don't see them reflected in the plan there. And then the third piece is, and I think it's reflected, but through the Mayor to Colin, just to confirm this, the advisory land use recommendations, I did hear it was a really good discussion, and I see a number of recommendations on there. And I just, you know, I really want to make sure that we're taking those recommendations to heart, because those are our community members that are giving us official recommendations through a group. Thank you.
May I add, through the mayor, there is a plan for some greening around Sunstone with a community garden that is their overall community plan there. And certainly, you know, within the recreation zone master plan, there is opportunity for people to obviously impact what will sit in that site. So.
Yeah, I think one of the issues we're all talking about and we're faced with, we want to provide affordable housing, we want to provide more housing. If you look at these 34 lots, what do we do? Say, take 2 lots out to put in places for people to gather and parks. We do that, the infrastructure costs don't change. So they just pass along those costs to 32 lots instead of 34. So, you know, where do we balance that off? And that becomes a real issue. If you look at all the stratas in town, the majority of stratas in town, there are no green spaces. And that is that good or bad? Well, for some people, it's not good because they want a place to walk the dog and have the kids. But on the other hand, there's a lot of people who say, I want to be able to afford to live in Pemberton. So I'm willing to give something up. And I'll walk a little bit further to do that. So it's a real balance, and pricing is a big thing. Unless we start going up more than 3 stories and we start increasing the size of building on a lot, we're not going to get what we want and still have green space in a small lot subdivision.
Yeah, well, I think it just kind of building off that question, I guess do we have an idea of what, you know, we've run an idea of maximum for what the lot sizes might be, but do we know, I mean, they talk about small family homes, but do we have an idea of what does that look like? Is that a 3-bedroom, 1,000 square foot home? And then, and in tandem with that is what's also the expected market price? Because I mean, we could be building small family homes, but you know, I would hate for this to happen and then it goes to market and then we start seeing $1.5 million homes for 1,000 square feet with 3 bedrooms and no parking space. And it's kind of, the question then becomes, who are these units being built for? Are they being built for residents? Are they, or, okay, maybe I'm getting too far ahead.
No,
First of all, yeah.
I don't think you do, I think part of the struggle is we can't govern or manage how market prices. So, you know, Tayada is a good example that there was some tensions for those smaller lots. And when they built at the height of the market, that they were going for way more than we ever hoped for. So I think to answer your question partly, not fully, it would be to our ability is not to control the price of those places once they've been agreed to be zoned and built. Our ability is to say, okay, well, you want a rezoning, we want to secure X amount of units that are non-market and that we do have rent control over. Or it could be, and there's a number of different ways that we can explore. It could be, you know, instead of on this particular property building a higher density townhouse or apartment building, just as an example, saying, you know, carriage homes or lock-off suites are permitted and have to be managed to, you know, are price managed in a certain way. Like,
Yeah.
do you follow what I'm saying? I didn't say it very well, so I don't know how you did.
No, and I want to be very clear. I understand that we can't control what the market prices are going to be, but I guess it's just a consideration is that if we're looking at this and talking about, this is an area that is currently zoned for natural resources. So I guess my question is we talk about, like, we've got infrastructure restraints, we have all of these restraints. We're talking about adding 34 units in here. Is considering the fact that if they become so, you know, if they end up going for some of the prices that you've seen in Sunstone, how many locals are actually going to be moving there, who are going to be living there? Which means the question begs, well, why are we building it in the same, like I'm getting really high level here, but I guess I just want to make sure that if we're approving a development to the best of our ability, we are having the development that is being built for primarily for the people who live here and who are gonna,
And that is a big reason for the conversation we're having right now. So this is another of those situations where if there was no rezoning required or variances asked for, it would be another one of those, okay, we have pretty limited controls. There is a rezoning or there is, you know, and a negotiation to be had. So it's up to us to discuss and send staff away and say, well, we want to see carriage houses, we want to see a high density building in there, we want to see lock-off suites, we want to see quote fourplexes, diverse, I don't know. As part of it, we can't dictate the whole design of the place, obviously, but we can say, hey, you're going to look for parking variances, or you're going to look for rezoning. Well, these are some of the needs that council really wants to see addressed. So to answer your question, yes, we can control that through this conversation, and we're not going to decide entirely now. We're going to send staff away. You're going to say, okay, this is stuff we want you to work on with the applicant. Just picking, you know, community gardens or more green space in the yard or more density for fourplexes or something like that, to explore that with the applicant and see where we can go with it. That's our controls. Those are our controls.
And then just, sorry, one last comment. It was just going back to that conversation about maybe the bigger picture. I understand the comment about, you know, if we sub-area plan would be very difficult, but if we do have, there's this property, and then if I understand correctly, the other two properties, but also they have to go through similar, they're not zoned, they have to go through rezoning. So maybe that's also an option to look at the three of them. I think was kind of being said is, okay, what elements need to be present amongst the three of them to kind of create this ideal community. And in tandem with that is we're also, we've got the housing needs assessment that's coming out a couple of months from now. So I also wonder is, I mean, is it premature to maybe be talking about some of this until we see the housing assessment? Because we could say to staff, okay, go back, look at all these types of housing. But if we have our housing assessment needs that comes down 6 weeks later and says, oh, by the way, this is all the housing you're missing, and it's not what we've recommended to staff, like it just kind of seems like we've either missed the opportunity or we're doubling back and redoing work. So I also don't know if it's worth it.
Staff want to respond to that at all before you go on?
I'm
Not
happy.
really.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. I think, I'm not sure who's first. Gina,
And
then.
just a quick point, you're wondering about cost of building. The other night I talked to Cam, they're looking at trying to put something together up on their site that would be under $1 million. That would be at $400 to $500 a square foot, and that would be only 1,200 square foot. And it would come in just with the land, it'd be just under $1 million. So that'll give you some idea that if you're building a 2,000 square foot house with a suite, you're $1.5 million regardless. That's the builder's number.
Oh, no, yeah.
Nothing I came up with, but and that's a spec house. If you want a custom house, it's $600 plus.
Yeah.
A square foot. Cheap. At half the price of the
Just to echo Councillor Ramsden, I mean, I think I agree that we're gonna get this housing report and based on just. What we heard a few minutes ago, that the gap isn't actually in, correct me if I'm wrong. That the gap in Pemberton that they've seen so far is. Not families with children, like it's not it's the individuals, right? And so that. Are the individuals wanting single family homes, or are they wanting something different? And so I don't think we're trying to, we're thinking about this sort of what kind of housing needs to go there, but we haven't got a wholesome, fulsome picture of what we actually need yet.
I mean, we're not, genius around the corner in terms of getting that housing needs assessment. We're gonna see that pretty soon here. I feel like we're not stalling things in any unreasonable way by saying, okay, you definitely want some input from that housing needs assessment to help inform this conversation. I think in the meantime, there are still some really good thoughts that have been brought up here today that staff can work on a little bit with the applicant. The applicant's listening, they've heard. I would kind of like to give staff a chance to consider the higher level, whatever you want to call it, view. In other words, how do we look at, to me, it would be especially around, commercial and amenity space and community gardens and green space, how those are being addressed collectively in that whole area without having to go into a full sub area plan, but just so that we can come up with some sort of metrics to be able to say, well, you should supply at least this percentage of green space on your development, redwoods, you should provide X amount of garden space or whatever, right? So I don't, and maybe this is a really tough, unrealistic nut to crack for you guys, but I feel like if we, at this point, without putting you on the spot right here now, I feel like we can wrap this conversation up fairly soon here and say, hey, staff, you've got some comments to go work with, let's work on that, let's wait and get our housing needs assessment and then put it all together. Yeah.
That sounds fair. And just going back to the question about strata, is it, from a planning perspective or like a municipal operations perspective, is strata versus, is there any benefit of one over the other, I guess, I'm just thinking like long-term planning, we know this area is going to grow, there's a increased expansion in the area. Is like having a stratified subdivision better in the long run from a like high level municipal management point of view, or is it better that if E freehold and that the streets are built wider, et cetera? And I don't know if that's an easy.
I don't know if it's better or not, or we have any control, but we can't do anything about it. If they want to stratify, they can stratify. That's not, we can't say no. This has to be a fee simple.
Well, I mean, could we not, my understanding is that we're not obligated to say yes to this zone, like rezoning, right? I mean,
No.
like in the same way that we're saying, they're coming to us with this proposal of what it's going to look like. We could, if, let's say for some reason, I have no idea, and that's why I'm asking the question, freehold is much better long-term management planning view for the municipality. Could we not say, well, we would like to see what it would look like if you subdivided it as freehold lots. So that's why I'm asking the question, is just if there's any benefit to it, and there may not be. I just was wondering.
Either of you have a comment on this one?
Yeah, through the chair, I need to double check that exactly. I don't believe my knowledge, my understanding is that because decision to go fee simple or strata would happen at subdivision. And so that's the remit of the approving officer and governed by the Land Title Act. And so I'm trying to recall, but it's not coming to mind whether or not the municipality has any influence over that decision. I can't recall, so I will circle back on that for you. In terms of, from my perspective, or at least I think, from a cost perspective, strata would be a strata subdivision is putting no burden on the village's infrastructure or asset pool. So from that perspective, it's preferable. It's essentially less maintenance, less costs, less operations that the village has to take on. Now that burden is being shifted to the strata. And so that's why they pay strata fees to maintain that infrastructure in the long term.
Isn't it also the case that if we went away from strata, the roads become wider, sidewalks and curbs and gutters, now all of a sudden you've got smaller lots. So what do we want to do? We want to put a reasonable home on a lot, but if you take another 2 or 3 meters off the front of a house, what do you got left to build on?
Yeah, I don't know, and I understand there's definitely trade-offs there. So that's why I was just also asking from municipal planning view, the idea that, that this community is going to continue to grow just from an infrastructure point of view, maintenance, et cetera. Was there a preference or not a preference? Is it what? Yeah, that's why I was asking the question.
Okay, well, let's put that on the list for bringing back.
Oh, I was just to Councillor Craddock's point, it costs a developer more to develop an area like this at municipal standards, which then gets reflected back in the price of lots and the cost. So it's one of those circular things. You can go strata, which costs the developer less in terms because they don't have to meet all the municipal standards from road and sidewalk and street lighting and all of that kind of thing. But then there's the strata fees. But on the flip side, if you have to build to municipal standards, there's more costs and that gets down loaded to the purchaser.
Yeah, and I was just, I would guess the question is also like, how does that hold out in today's market too? Because that, if properties are going, I don't know, 1.5 million or something like that. I mean, at one point, is somebody going to be, would it actually end up making that much difference if the property is going to sell for 1.5 million anyway? I don't know. And that's why I was asking, is just to see how that bears out.
Just a simple question. I'm just curious, was the sub-area plan not done when it was transferred? Was it a cost thing, really? Was that, no, that was before.
To the chair, not sure if it is the exact translation of that intention, but what we do have is the hillside special planning area. And so I think that tried to capture some amount of that at the time. It's not as thorough as the sub-area plan is, but I think maybe that's at the time. They did try to carry through that intention in the form of that hillside special plan.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's because I think that was 2011. And yeah, I think we would all acknowledge that again, like so many things have changed, and things that might not have been included then are absolutely necessary now.
I think too, with the sub-area plan, your zoning is already in place, and there was a lot of that area that had not yet been zoned or in the OCP. So, and there wasn't a desire at the time to zone those, preferring rather to wait, because then you can get zoning amenities and all of that kind of thing. So even if there'd been a sub-area plan, there's a likelihood that some of those parcels out there would not have necessarily been captured as part of that, because it wouldn't have applied, because we wouldn't have known at the time what the potential owner would want to zone it for. That makes sense. It wasn't set in stone that it would be housing. So there was a lot of sort of moving parts when that property all came into the village, and it happened quite suddenly. And there was, desire to move in certain areas forward faster than other areas. So, if it had been sitting like the benchlands for a number of years, just all sitting, then I think that probably would have been an opportunity, but it didn't kind of fall out that way.
Start moving us towards the resolution, just in case
Yeah.
anybody's interested. Go ahead.
I just had one last comment. So if we're looking at this, I guess my comment would be or one of my last comments would be that I think I would like to see what was proposed as maybe one of the recommendations is looking at not just single family dwelling home, but a mix of housing types. I think particularly given that the provincial government sounds like they're coming out with, they're going to override single family dwellings zoning as is. It would seem maybe prudent to open it up from the get-go, and then that might also give us some more flexibility in terms of providing affordable options, like, you know, a mix of maybe we had some low-rise apartments, townhomes, and single family dwelling homes, and make it instead of just having one neighborhood of one type of housing mixture.
Jenny?
Go ahead, Councilor Hunter.
I was just going to try and move us towards a resolution. Like I feel like we're all sort of saying very similar things. Councillor Ramsden, I think you're hitting a home run. Like you just keep bringing up the most important pieces. And I don't know within the recommendations where all of this fits, but you know, are we being urged to vote on sending it back for the planning department to take all of these various feedback pieces and come back again? Because if
Yeah,
that's the case, you know, I'm happy to lead a resolution on that.
Yeah, I definitely. think
recommendation.
Sorry to interrupt. I definitely think the recommendations as laid out don't capture this conversation. I would suggest that it's a resolution. And I'm just gonna throw a bunch of stuff down that doesn't sound like a resolution, but the resolution should capture some of the biggest comments that I'm hearing are to have staff go back and work with the applicant. Well, there's two sides, working with the applicant and there's some staff work on their own. The staff work on their own would be to perhaps come back with a bit of a recommendation or a conversation that we could have around collective commercial and neighborhood service space within that whole area, green and gathering space within that whole area, like the whole Sunstone Ridge area plateau. So some way for us to wrap our heads around, you know, feeling comfortable that we're providing enough of those spaces collectively throughout the whole neighborhood. So some sort of way to manage that would be a staff on their own thing. And then working with the applicants who's listening to these comments to talk about a greater diversity of housing and therefore a greater diversity of affordable options. You know, again, it could be a range from individual affordable units to lock-off suites to fourplexes, whatever. And not, you know, so some of that diversity that will lead to more and diverse affordable options. That yeah, I had like connectivity to the other parts of the neighborhood and trails, that sort of thing, but I think that comes in later. Anyway, like if we want to talk about how one neighborhood connects to the rec site and then to the next with trails, is that the right place for that?
Actually, defer to Mr. Brown.
Sorry, yeah, there's Colin.
Yeah, I think that might be captured in that first point, that collective. Right, I have it down as the other uses of commercial green space. Community space, right? So the trails and network is in there.
That capture. Yeah. So, yeah, now let's. I don't know if you're still with us, Councillor Helmer. That was sort of where I was thinking of them having seen the motion going at this point.
He appears to have left.
Done.
Sorry, there is a message here. She has to go, yeah.
Okay. So yeah, that's to me where we're sort of moving towards, and I do want to get some feedback from staff in terms of, are you sitting there going, oh crap, does this make any sense to all of you? Because it's got to make sense for you to be able to bring back something productive. But first of all, am I missing anything in what I just laid out in terms of some of the thoughts that have come out from all of you? That motion, that's not a motion, kind of capture it. Okay, now I'd like to hear from Mr. Brown turns. Sinking lower in your chair.
So, sure, through the chair. So just hearing the conversation around the table and trying to kind of wrap my head around where I could imagine this going, more for expectations than anything, so that we're all on the same page. Between Mr. Brown and myself and our soon to start summer student, we have a very little capacity to carry on in a great deal of detailed planning work on top of what we currently are doing. So what all this to say is what we could come back with is a fairly basic analysis of these concepts. And so if that is what council is looking for, we're on the same page. If council would like to see something a little bit more thorough, we would probably be looking to the applicant to support that effort. Through either cost recovery or some sort of mechanism like that. And so, that's
fair. And I think in terms of the expectation, I don't think we're trying to get to a point where it says, each development has to provide X% of green space per unit, or like, I don't think we want to get to that level of detail. We want to make sure that we're considering it somehow through an overall lens for the whole neighborhood. I don't know if that lessens the expectation a little bit, as opposed to trying to really break it down to a metrics that says, this is what you need for community gardens per unit, this is what you need for dog. It's more to make sure that we're actually, we feel that we're looking through a lens of that whole neighborhood when we're considering these options. If there was, just a silly example, there was another proposal right next door and they were going to build a massive gathering field, then I don't need this one to have it, right? They can provide the gardens, but we want to, so it's not everybody has to provide this much garden and gathering space. It's just making sure somehow that we feel we're doing the right thing by doing all that. Is that?
Yeah, through the chair or.
Through the chair, and I think this goes to what Scott is saying in terms of simplifying, in terms of a resolution going forward. I think we need to simplify this a little bit and get a little bit tighter, so we actually end up with a product that represents what you're looking for. And right now, I think it's
We have no idea.
unwieldy.
Well, that's what I said. I didn't present it as a motion. I capture the thoughts here and now boil it down to the motion. That wasn't, that's what I had said at the beginning, it's not a motion.
We're happy to take that away and to work on that, I think, and to try to wrap our heads around exactly what that might look like. We could take a first pass at it for council, and then exactly depending on if that meets the bar that council was looking for, great. And if you'd like to see more detail, then perhaps we'll look at another avenue to pursue.
Okay, so maybe go ahead.
Sorry, if I might, there's CAC contributions in this, isn't it? So we got to remember too, if we take that CAC contributions and put it into then that field, where it'd be community gardens and more green space, we got to remember there's some dollars there we could put towards that. So let's not forget that portion of it. So if they built out what they did, and there's $1.98 that we can put in some green space and places to sit and places to park, kids to walk. And the dogs, we got to remember that's part of this plan.
Yeah.
So we have to work that into what our vision is,
That's part of the thing, yeah.
right?
So let's break it into a couple of motions then. So let's have a motion to direct staff to go back and then come back with some suggestions on how we could look at these neighborhood spaces collectively for that area. For the plateau, what do we call that area? What's the whole area called?
Hillside.
Hillside, okay, the hillside area, even down there is part of the hillside?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's do that. A motion, is that clear enough? To just come back with some suggestions and see, as you say, if you hit the mark or not? So
I would say so, Mr. Brown.
Yeah, I think so. We can take it back to our team and then ourselves kind of dive into it a bit and then come back with some options on how to proceed.
okay, so let's get a motion on that. Moved by Councilor Nightingale, seconded by Councilor Ramsden. Any further discussion on that motion? The objection, motion passes. And now perhaps a motion to go back to have staff go back to the applicant and explore housing diversity or options for housing diversity and affordability within this general I think it'll also buy us, not buy us time, but it'll allow them to do some work while we wait for our housing needs assessment.
Would that come under option 3? I think it's pretty close.
Probably all under option 3.
Removing the 35 lot subdivision, removing sub A. That
Just going with.
but just taking the length, yeah, just taking, well, option 3 is that you recommend that council staff prepare an OCP and zoning bylaw amendments with all of those things.
I think the order was different in the presentation, so I think it's the one that the other option for the committee.
Which,
Is
sorry.
is this down here somewhere? Can I read this somewhere?
It's this one, right? Option 3. Which is allows for 35 lot subdivision as presented in the conceptual plan, work with the applicant to determine an appropriate housing mix that includes house plexes, provision area for secondary suites, co-housing is permitted on lots 27, 28,
Yeah.
or
Could
a
be.
combination thereof.
Combination thereof, and anything else.
It's basically B, 3B, not without the A.
Yeah, but not without the A, that's fine. Yeah.
Gotcha. With that, yes.
So just if I can 3B, okay, 3B.
Moved by Councillor Kadic, seconded by Councillor Ramsden. Further discussion? Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Thank you. You might want everything, make things complicated, but we want to get this right, as you pointed out, so much appreciated.
Yeah. That's good.
Hey, one more item. It's burned 5.2. We're talking about the daycare playscape engagement plan.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. I appreciate you have a very long afternoon already. Okay, so the purpose for this report is to receive input from the committee of the whole on the engagement plan that we prepared. As council may recall, at the February 28th meeting, staff was directed to develop this plan and bring it back to you for feedback. So this is where we're at. The purpose of this is to obtain feedback from the communities to help inform your decision-making process in the relocation of the nature playscape from the Pemberton and District Community Center that has been removed due to the development of the new daycare space. Our goal is that we create public park space that is meaningful and enjoyable for the whole community, and we create a space that the community loves and uses and wants to care for. So basically, I'll move on to Appendix A, which is page 44. And it's the community engagement plan that former community communications coordinator Vinka Hutchinson helped create. With the objective again is to obtain public feedback on the options that were presented to council back in February. We've identified the stakeholders. We've identified the key messages that we will be presenting to the community. We've taken a shot at identifying the risks that are potential outcomes. One of them is a no clear winner, which would send us back to the consultation stage again. And that will be what the data tells us, right? And obviously a report will be generated following the completion of the campaign. And in the timeline of the whole implementation process, we've outlined, should we be moving forward here quickly, that, well, actually we'll be able to hopefully turn around the results of the engagement for June the 20th report so that we can move forward from that perspective. And then basically we have on, I guess it's page 51, is Appendix B of the council package.
I'm sorry, Jim.
Oh, no, that's okay. Take your
It's the
time.
third time I'm bringing it up and I still don't get correct on all of the pages.
Oh,
I have a hard copy like that.
Yeah, I just want to see the
Yeah.
surveys. Thank you very much. I'm sorry.
no, that's fine.
I know we had
That's
trouble
always
with this.
stressful issue about driving.
Yeah, it was a terrible day and I don't know which one I deleted, but obviously. Isn't that the way?
Fair enough. So you want to go to page 51,
Thanks.
Councillor Craddock?
And thank you for this.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
All right, so obviously we are using Have Your Say as our platform for getting this information out to the community. And all of this would be inputted into that website with all of the background information. We obviously start the survey off with what we're asking of people to consider. And that would be concept plans and the location analysis document that you received in February. We also want people to take into consideration the things that the landscape architect as well as myself took into consideration when those plans were initially developed. So that's where you've got the list of things for people to think about while they're reviewing the documents and then proceeding with the survey. We've got some demographic questions. Are you a resident of Pemberton? Yes or no? Which neighborhood do you live in? That will provide us some significant feedback as to the primary areas in which we targeted that provided information, which is great. Then we're asking some parent and caregiver information because this is a playground that is designed for 5 to 12-year-olds. We want to know what demographics are responding to the survey. Are they future users? Are they current users of this space? Are they past users of the space? I also look forward to getting that demographic data as well, because it will help inform other aspects of what we do from a recreation perspective. So, and where we need to grow. So that not only fuels this survey, it will also help potentially develop where we start to move forward in other areas. Then we want to ask them about how they use the current space at the Pemberton and District Community Center and its surrounding grounds. And because we're trying not to be leading with our questions, we want them to be able to we want the public to be able to give their feedback openly and honestly and not under pretense of any kind. So we're asking them about how to rate what they use the most and how they use it. And we're asking them to do that with all 11 things that we consider recreational space at the Pemberton and District Community Center. And then that'll allow us to provide some concrete data for councils from a decision-making perspective on what the community tells us they use. And then as well as what they prefer to use from a preference as well. So we're really hopeful that by asking the questions in this way, it provides concrete data and information for you to use moving forward around how this space is being utilized. And then we will ask about whether they're familiar with the nature play structure, have they reviewed the options? And then with question 9 and 10, it's they're given the options of 1, 2, and 3. We're hopeful that if number 3 is the option that is prioritized by the public through the survey, that this also will give us more data as to what they think option 3 looks like. And then that's why question 10 is tell us why you chose that option. So they can tell us if they don't like option 1, they don't like option 2, but they think Pioneer Park is where it needs to be located, or we need to move the knoll that the children roll down and ride down and put something there. So, and then that's also a potential as to whether we need to go back to the table and ask some more questions of the community or not moving forward. So through the chair, I welcome any questions or feedback or comments that you may have at this point.
Questions? That's right.
Just a clarifying question. I think you had said is if one of the risks is that we come back and there's not a clear clear preference amongst the community, and you said we'd have to go back to the public. Do we have to, or is that something we could sit there and be like, okay, well, communities pretty 50-50 on this, and then we, you know, we take that and make our decision from there? Okay.
100%.
Questions?
Question, thank you. Is the green space beside community center considered part of the community center?
Correct.
Okay.
So it is governed currently through PETUS, which is the Pemberton Valley Utilities Services Committee.
Don't even decide here, that's PBC.
Affirmative.
Questions? Right.
Yeah, a couple of things, I'm leaning towards option 3 myself personally in your report. The other thing too, under 6A, looking through things that you put in like open space, shade, privacy. One thing I don't see in that question is safety.
Okay.
And I think for me, which was brought out in the report, often one was considered less safe according to the consultants in option 2, and I think to me, that's the most important. So.
That could be added.
Yeah. The safe environment is safe, I don't know, you come up with the word, as long as safe is in there.
Okay.
Did you see an interest of the 3?
Oh, no, I just, under question 9,
Oh, okay.
I was looking at, for me,
No, because I was thinking of the recommended option.
I'm confusing in this time, I was looking at option 3 as another thing to look at.
Gotcha.
For the council is, we just talked about an area out Dendar. That needs more play space. And things for kids to do is maybe that a better place to put it, looking that area is gonna grow tremendously over the next 3 years. Does that make sense? We haven't discussed that, so I'm just gonna throw that out as.
I think that through the chair, I think that's definitely part of the conversation that will arise when the report is complete and the data is brought forward for your council to review for June 20th, for sure.
And with that, I keep forgetting, and would that kind of encompass potential other things that are coming up in the future that may not have to go in that area, but could start enhancing the Denver Park as we've got the space out there, it seems. We found the space for the bike park, which don't go out there right now because it's a little wet. It's roughing up, but you know, I'm just wondering if that was incorporated, that kind of thing.
If I may, I think that at this point in time, what's the decisions that have been made prior to my arrival include that the next amenity that the Village of Pemberton is focusing on is the development of a baseball diamond out there and what accessories come with a baseball diamond. And then beyond that, there have not been decisions made at this point in time on the rest of the use of that land. So that's a much bigger conversation, which I do believe is being addressed through the OCP process, which will potentially outline the need for a master recreation and parks plan be developed in the imminent future to determine anything that does any further development of Dendar property.
It just question, I'm hoping this is a question, not so much a comment. So 6A and 6B, they ask about, so what features do you value in an outdoor recreational area? Do you think there would be any benefit to us repeating that question? So keeping 6A and 6B, but then repeating it, but instead of it being an outdoor recreation area, specifically it asks about the Great Lawn, because what I think we were also hoping is to get an idea from the community is how do they value specifically the Great Lawn? Because I think what we were hoping is that if what we get back from the community is something that's very clearly says, we like the space, we want it to stay as is, that we would maybe be looking at creating some policy around maintaining that. So I was just wondering, is it, we had that question twice, but specific to the Great Lawn area, it gives us that information more about just recreation area, but then also specific to Great Lawn, if there's. Yeah, I don't know.
If I may respond to Councillor Ramsden with something along the lines, in order of preference, with 1 being most important, 11 being least important, what features do you value in the green space at Pemberton and District Community Center? Would that fulfill that instead of adding additional questions?
Yeah, I think it would. I also don't know if that means that you lose out on the, I just don't know if it, would there be value in having that question both times, because then that also gives us data about people's general feelings about, and that's why I was asking this question. I don't know. I don't create surveys. I'm sure there's a science behind it. If I may do this.
Do these things.
I know.
Yeah, it was a little tricky because I think embarked working on this with Christine, trying to incorporate the space for the notion of that in here without being leading. So that's, one of the reasons why it's a priority amongst all of the priorities, but there may be a way that we can do that more specifically. Christine, it seems like maybe you have an idea in your head as to how it could.
Yeah, I think that it's definitely. Yeah, no, I think that we could definitely, I mean, the goal obviously with the survey for community members is to make it as time sensitive as possible. So right now, as it stands, I think this only takes a few minutes to do, but adding a couple of questions would not be a problem, I don't think. I think we could definitely add something like generic enough, but leading enough, but defining enough for that specific green space. Yeah.
So first of all, to sort of preface what I'm going to say is I want to commend Emma Gillis and Ms. Burns on the incredibly inclusive, cohesive, community-centered programming and servicing of the community center, the indoor space, because it is the hub of this community through all the work that you two, I would say, do. And so the reason I say that is because, and the reason I asked the question about the Great Lawn is because, I'm going to call it the green space, is because if it is a facility of the community center, as is the rec for youth and seniors, then I would assume that the mandate and vision and goals that are applied on the inside of the space would apply to the outside. And so when we talk, what I'm wondering is, rather than focusing on infrastructure, is it possible to ask a question to the public about inclusion? Do you value the green space for, rather than what things they like, about the people that are going to use it? Do you value the green space for youth? Do you value the green space for young people? Do you value the green space for elders? Do you value it for seniors? Because then, right now, there's no opportunity for an elder or a senior to have there is no infrastructure for them. And so they can't necessarily answer maybe truthfully that piece of the survey. So I'm wondering if there's a way that we can think about the people as opposed to the people as opposed who are using it as opposed to the things that are in the space.
I like that.
Because the reason I mentioned Ms. Gillis and Ms. Burns is that I know in the interior space of the community center, there are no primary and secondary stakeholders. It's for everybody. And I would assume that then the outdoor space would not have primary or secondary stakeholders. It would be for all people. And so maybe there are people who think it should legitimately just be for young kids. It might be. And if that's the case, that's the case. And the only, we're also going to be, unfortunately, speaking for people that aren't already in our community, because if we look at the density beside that green space, which is potentially going to be 300, 400 people, the closest green space they are going to have people who aren't living there yet is going to be right there. And so I suppose my thinking goes more towards people as opposed to the infrastructure.
So how would you propose we frame that?
Well, the questions to people are, I suppose it's sort of like when you put pictures to young people about what amenities they like, and they put a swimming pool is there, they're all gonna put dots on the swimming pool, right? Obviously, that's what they're gonna do, because that's what they want and they don't have it. And so what I'm saying is that if we just ask the community, who is that green space for? That's the number one question. Who does the community feel that it's for? If the community feels that it's genuinely a playground, then that's what they feel. But if other people don't, if they feel it's for elders, seniors, youth, and everybody, we need to get that information as well. We need to know what, you know what I mean?
I'm just trying to understand how we frame, I mean.
Yeah.
And just trying to
And
understand how
again,
we
sorry,
frame.
I don't write surveys, so I can't, but I'm just trying to put the idea out there as to how it can be reframed to approach it in the way that the interior space would be approached. Which is incredibly inclusive.
I wonder if it's, I'm just gonna take a shot in the dark here, an open-ended question around the community center seeks to create an inclusive space for all. No, this is not gonna work. We're gonna be trying to bring this. Space for all, similar in both indoor and outdoor spaces. Who do you feel, what groups do you feel are best served by this space?
And then the list of the.
And maybe not even a list, but just have it be an open-ended question.
Because-
But again, I think that's, I get worried that that's leading, yeah.
I feel it's hard for somebody to say they'd like to have a bench under a tree to sit and read because there isn't that opportunity. So they don't have an option in the list that's there to do that, right? So I'm turning it around to be more about the value of the space as opposed to the operation of the space.
I'm just spitballing off the top of my head, like that. I like the idea of maybe like an open-ended question, because they find maybe not leaving, and also giving people that freedom to say, well, what I want is a bench in which I can read, or I'd like to see more opportunities for seniors to access and use this space. So I'm wondering, something along the lines of when you consider the great lawn, the green space, what's important to you for that space, or how do you value space? What's the value for you if in the space or something like that? Sorry.
No, that's okay, if I may. So I think that I feel like we're asking all of those questions currently with the way that the questions have been tailored. However, I do hear you in that. So for instance, in question 4, it's do you regularly recreate at the Pemberton District Community Center and or surrounding grounds? And we just have yes and no. If we added a 4A, if no, why not? Provides people with the opportunity to share why they may not utilize anything in the space or in the surrounding areas. And then ideally, it's if they're assuming they are, and our goal is luckily that through the engagement process, we have access to all demographics that currently utilize the space. So we will be reaching out to the seniors. We will be providing the iPad at the community center to fitness participants, to library. Emma's involved. Their team knows they'll be assisting people with accessing the computers there to do the survey. We have the iPad. Whenever we have spare staff, we are just going to randomly ask people in the lobby area waiting for other programs There's all the various seniors groups that utilize the rec currently as well as the youth. So we do anticipate, we do actually anticipate a large percentage of the community participating in this survey because we're going to be able to word of mouth, face to face, speak to them. So I think that there's potential of adding to go back. So that's the people piece. Hopefully, Councillor Nightingale, that I think might address your people question a little bit more. Like if you're not using our space, why aren't you using it? And then they would be able to tell us, like what don't they use? Then they go into the preferences. Then in 6B, they can tell us their other, like if they chose other, why did you choose other? And hopefully that's where they add, I think we need a walking track surrounding the green space so that I can get my 10,000 steps a day on a clean, clear surface. Right. I mean, my mother would put that in. So there is, I do believe that we've given ample opportunity. I do think that I could potentially add accessibility as one of 6A's. That would be more in line with inclusivity. In the sense that if accessibility is what you value. And I do think that we will get a variety of community members that will tick that box as number one to a certain extent. And then we can see what see how the priorities lie from that perspective. Does that help clarify where I think I heard you go?
It does, thank you. And what I would ask though is if it's possible to separate. So question 4 is, do you regularly recreate at the Pemberton District Community Center? That's one question.
Yeah.
And it's a separate question. Do you use the green space? It's a separate question. It's not in one because they are two very separate things.
Sure, we can do that.
And I would, it would be my preference that we don't ask people about where they want the nature playscape, because the question is about the use and the value of the lot primarily. And from that data and information, then we will know because that in itself is a separate issue from how we're valuing that space. And I don't know how I'm not being able to articulate this very well, but if it comes back that there are some seniors or teens who say, I'd love to use the green space, but there's nowhere for me to use it because there's a lot of kids playing it, it's great, and there's lots of kid infrastructure, but we've asked the question, it's got to be A or B, then like, why does that have to be part of our decision at that point?
If I can jump in now and wait a little bit, I like where we're going. I like the way we're trying to flush out some of these items. I mean, that's where the ultimate decision we're trying to make here is where that space goes. And I hear what you're saying. If we just ask, do you want an A or B, that's all they're going to answer. So I'm happy like with your additional questions and exploring, trying to find the value. Why do you? The new question 4 will be, do you use the great lawn or the green space? If so, for what? And what do you enjoy about it? Well, give me a quiet place to read or whatever. So that I'm happy to go there, but I think we do need to get some clarity from people in terms of where. So maybe it's not quite phrased. Okay, you want A or B? Maybe it's a matter of following some of your more general statements or value statements with, I mean, we finish with that. I mean, I think at the end, we're opening up, we're asking all these questions to figure out where to put the play park. So we're exploring that without trying to be leading, which is difficult, but for sure. But you know, by going through those questions, do you use the green space? Yes, I'm a senior and I use it for this, I'm whatever, I use it for that. Okay, that's good. I don't use it because there's nothing for me to use. There's nowhere for me to sit under the tree and read or whatever, right? Hopefully we get some that sort of broad answers. And somehow frame, you know, if it's not phrased exactly the way it is, I still feel we need to ask fairly specifically, with all that in mind, where would you like to see it? Would you like to see it in option 1, option 2, or neither, option 3? Because it does cut into where I would prefer seeing a bench under a tree or whatever. But I think we do need to get back to that somewhat specific at a certain point here, which is kind of the goal. You know, this is what we've been struggling with on this decision for a while, and I get that it's based in values and bigger thinking, which is where you're trying to stay rooted, which I respect. But I also think we have to get to a decision-making point, and so I like to combine both in there if we could. Yes. Go ahead.
But just, Councilor Mankell, I think I understand your concern. It's kind of, we're basically trying to have 2 separate conversations in one survey. In an ideal world, we could separate them out, but I think for time sensitivity and also community engagement, because I think that's one issue is if you're constantly going back to community, we may get really good engagement on a first go around, but if we try to do the second time for a different topic, people are like, oh, I just answered a survey. I don't know if that's true. What I'm wondering, and I don't know if this software would allow for this, but I mean, could we almost break it up? Not break it up, but the playscape questions are all down at the end. So maybe that's also something where we make it, you know, playscape questions optional so that people don't have to answer them if they don't want to. And then that kind of maybe is a subtle message that the first part is like, is one thing. And then for those people looking to give specific feedback on the playscape, you can, I don't know. The other thing too, I was going to say is it's not, we are providing them with a third option, which is other. Like, you know, and maybe the vast majority of people are going to say, nope, we don't even want it here. We want it somewhere else. In which case, yeah, or anywhere.
No, I mean, anywhere.
Yeah. I don't know.
If I may, through the chair, I do agree with there is a time sensitivity here. I think there's also a risk to, you know, people who we've responded to have an expectation that there will be a level of engagement on this, and this has been created per the direction of the motion from the February 28th meeting. But what we tried to do is ensure that there was a nuanced introduction of the concept around just the general uses of the spaces and what spaces were important to people as an opportunity through the survey without actually eclipsing the original intent of the survey, which was to identify where the community would like to see the playscape rehomed. And so I guess I realize that there is a deeper discussion around the value of the Great Lawn. And I think that if council wished to go further to that direction and deviate from this, then perhaps the bigger conversation would be around a master plan that would then go through a consultant that would be through PBIS. In order to do a greater exploration of all of these spaces and, you know, where the community is at with the value of each one of these spaces and apparatuses and opportunities. But as far as, you know, I just want to say that I believe that Christine and I did a very good job of capturing the original intent based on the motion, which is the directive from which we, you know, take our work. But that's, yeah.
I appreciate it as well. I do want to be clear though, because I specifically did ask for not to have the option of is it A or B. I wanted it to be value-based questions, keeping that part separate. So I did say that on the February 28th meeting, just to be clear. But, and I recognize that this is all very time sensitive. But what it's coming back to for me is that because it's strangely similar to the conversation we just had, is that because there has never been an overarching vision for the space, we're now trying to figure out, you know, how we should use it. And there's an incredible amount of density that's going to be right beside it. And the only green space for those people, the closest green space is that green space. And in an urban center, which you kind of have to think of that density as it's going to be very urban, a green space has to accommodate all types of people. And that's the motivation behind the value-based questioning that I'm leading. And I do appreciate the time and energy that has gone into it. And I really appreciate, as I've said, how inclusive that community center is to our community. And I would like to see the same. I would like to see the same for that green space. And I'm nervous that the potential for that not to happen could be there. And I think that's incredible. I'm not pointing a finger, just because of people, when we talk about stakeholders, there's a very, very vested interest of stakeholders in this space. And then that can potentially lead to an outcome that is not future-proof. It is actually quite short-sighted.
Do you think if option 3 had, like on question 9, if option 3 had sort of laid out differently, we got 1, which is AB. And it doesn't even have to be in that order. Option 3 can become option 1. But you know, when it says other, please provide specifics. Trying to find a way to make sure that people know that it's not A or B or nothing, as to your point. Like if option 3 or B 3 was other. And again, I want to say something, but it would be leading, you know, preserve the green space, put it somewhere else, or, you know what I mean? Like I'm trying to find room for that within.
I think as long as the question is there, the question is there. And I mean, it all comes back to that question. Really, the survey comes back to that question. Right there. Do you like option 1 or option 2? Or, yeah. Even after all the.
But if we explored a better option 3s, and do you think we would still have the same?
I think unless you specifically said it, if you said, oh, like Pioneer Park or Dendorf Park or whatever it might be, because the thing that comes to my mind is that what if there was no green space? What if the green space there wasn't anywhere? What would we do? Like if there was nowhere to put this play structure, what would we do? We wouldn't chuck it in the garbage. We would figure something out, right?
Okay.
Like, what if there was nowhere to put it there? What if there were already a bunch of picnic tables there for people to sit
There's
at?
no room, yeah.
Yeah, there's no room. What would we do? What
So
would we do with it?
we remove the existing one because we're expanding the daycare.
What would we do?
I-
We would think outside the box. And we would think, okay, that's the only green space that there is for all members of our community right here. But oh, potentially, could we consider Dendorf Park? There's nothing there right now. Could we? And we've just had a conversation about how we need to address that issue, that the communities in that area hasn't been addressed.
So again, can we
So I guess-
explore that through option 3?
That's, well, maybe if we actually put specifics, I think other than other, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, what
But I
I'm trying to
don't-
do is flush out, so we don't have to bring this back in a month.
I don't want to bring it back. Yeah,
So
I
I'm trying to
absolutely
flush out-
don't want to bring it back. I promise you. 'Cause
So I'm trying to accommodate your line of thinking, and so so you're saying option 3 could say other examples, Dendorf Park, Pioneer Park. Like, does that satisfy part of your
if
concern
we're
by?
not, I'm not sure can we put that?
Yeah, no, I
Okay.
think that we can definitely add it. Wouldn't you think, Christine, examples within the context of the other, so that people, it'll start to stimulate thinking around where that could be?
If there are a couple of other concrete examples and then even another, you know, because something we might not even think about, like we're not the smart, you know what I mean? There's other.
If I may, jump in before you hear something.
You can.
If I may, sure.
Go ahead.
I think that we strayed away from providing examples for option 3 because we want to get that from the people. So, however, I mean, we can add it. Our goal is not to lead them to a yes or no answer. Yes or no, I do not have children, you know, that's kind of a given, but even there, you'll notice that I made it so that everyone can respond. And it's, so we're not looking for ideally, like, you know, familiar with the nature play structure, yes or no, we want to know that. But then that triggers them hopefully to go back to why they're doing the survey, which is all the information that's been provided to them at the front end. Like we top load with information, and then we drill down. I am here to hear your feedback, and if you would like option 3 to have specific examples, I am happy to put those in there. And one of those examples can be preserve Great Lawn as green space, move to Pioneer. Researcher already has a half decent one and no space, but Dendaf, I think I would need to discuss with probably Scott various spaces that have been identified for recreation besides that. And then it's, you know, we also need to be mindful of PVIS to a certain extent, and that recreation is still a shared service that we provide to the community. So maybe they want it at Gates, right? So maybe that's another example that we add in there. Through the mayor again, Councillor Nightingale, I believe had.
Yeah, that's why I'm chairing, because she's Councillor Ramsden.
Councillor.
This could also. I preface this could be a terrible idea, so if this is just.
There are no terrible ideas.
That should represent everything. like
Yeah. But I was also wondering, I mean, would an option be to. It's also just to split the surveys. It's just to run 2 separate surveys concurrently at the same time, like have one survey after the other. The first one it's not, it might not, it wouldn't be titled Nature Play Park Relocation Survey. It could just be like, use a space, and then right after we run the one that is nature play specific, and then just basically cut the however many questions at the end and move them over to the other one. I don't know.
You can make it one to, I think, you're gonna achieve the same goal by maybe having like the very general value sort of statements at the beginning and then lead into, or vice versa. To
This is a survey. I would like to instill some confidence for you in that I do believe that the data will speak to you on June 20th when I present it. I do believe that all of the concerns that you have will be something that you can have a concrete conversation in regards to moving forward. I very much, I spent most of my vacation but it's a good thing. I enjoy doing this sort of thing, and I'm excited about engaging the community. This is why I'm here, right? Like, let's do this for the community, and this is why you're here as well. So I do believe that with some of these additions and a couple of minor tweaks, that the data that you're going to receive will be rich enough for you to see the answer. If that's and I will eat my words on June 20th if I do not believe so. And I will come to you on June 20th and I'll say, it doesn't do what I wanted it to do for you. And how do we go from there? And that will be the conversation at that point, if that helps. Because surveys are very challenging to produce so that you get an unbiased, honest feedback from the individuals that you're trying to engage. They're very challenging, but I do think that we're going in the right direction. It took a fair bit of wordsmithing and we went through multiple options, but I feel really good, and I get a sense that you will with the data that you receive.
Well, I thank you, and I really hear what you're saying, and I know your intention is the same for outside as it is for the inside space. And so the one thing it's a little bit of a detail, if I would prefer if it wasn't referred to as the Great Lawn, but just the green space.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's what I wrote.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
If I may, since my arrival in 2020, since COVID pushed everyone outside, we have developed some shade and seating plans for outdoor space that meet all community and all demographic needs moving forward. We just haven't been successful in receiving grant monies to do that, because we're looking at close to $100,000 to do everything that we want to do. But we are looking at how to do bits and bobs as we go. And one of them is shaded seating. And it would be in my second quarter report, but we did receive the BC Hydro regreening grant. So we are planning on bolstering some of the trees and things like that around the space moving forward with the construction of the daycare as well. So they are all things that I do think about on a regular basis. And, if I were filling out the survey, I would put, I want a walking trail that's 500 meters so I can get my 10,000 steps. That's accessible.
Let me tell you, that's not a vision you want to see.
Okay, we gotta wrap this up sooner or later. I feel like we made some good suggestions for the survey.
Yeah.
We feel they've been captured. You guys just been looking at YouTube, especially because you have the most input there. Do we need a motion on that? Yeah, I guess we should have a motion to recommend to council that the council direct staff to go ahead with the engagement process on the playscape with the changes recommended by the committee. That makes sense? You gonna move around that?
I'm just looking at your dates. That won't come up till the May 7th meeting, though.
May 9th.
I'm sorry, May 9th.
Yeah.
Because this is just a recommendation to council. We can't give you.
Well, we still have a council meeting.
We go back to council.
We're gonna go back.
Yeah, we can rise this report from committee of the whole this afternoon.
No, like tonight, it's this afternoon, we go back to regular, so we could always, because Ted's point is, committee has to recommend it to council, council has to approve it. Council could approve that direction today. Can I get a mover? Councilor Evans, second by Councilor Nightingale, any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Christine, appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, no, my pleasure.
Can I get a motion to adjourn committee of the whole, please?
Yeah.
By Councilor Scott, second by Councilor Ramsden, any opposed to adjourn?
Go back into regular.
Maybe did we send a message to front desk? It's
To the studio.
no, I told him 4 o'clock, I'll be done for sure.
Can you hit it out someone?
No, we gotta go back.
Can you go back?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, so I have to go back in camera. Where do I gotta go back? So we are.
I was gonna say that was very polite, that nobody said that was a terrible idea to split this survey. There is. no-
We just thought-
Yeah.
That's such a teacher thing to say, but I gotta disagree. There are some really terrible ideas out there. I don't care how generous you are.
You have to be able to say that. You have to. Yeah.
Doesn't mean there's no terrible ideas.
No.
And your statement wasn't, you should say it anyway,
Yeah.
even if it is terrible. You said there's no terrible ideas.
That's what I meant. Yeah.
Different.
Okay, so we're gonna go back.
You know how many terrible ideas there are?
I was just reading something about entrepreneurs
Are we still
and
recording?
how they're
Are
like
we?
going to now.
Would we have to come back into regular?
Yeah.
We're still on,
We're still recording and
you have to go back to.
so I have to go back into regular.
Okay.
So we're gonna,
We open the regular business meeting. Now for a motion to go on camera.
We're gonna rise with report
All
from,
right, we're gonna do that first. Okay.
rise with report.
So we write the report from this afternoon's committee, of the whole.
Um, we're just rising on the survey.
Just on the survey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The engagement plan.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and seeking a resolution of council.
Okay. Tina,
Sorry.
would somebody like to move that?
Just trying to get you back on track there.
And somebody like to move the survey plan and the engagement plan from the committee of the whole? Councillor Robinson, second by Councillor Nightingale, discussion, any opposed, motion carries. Here, now we'll go for a motion to go back in camera. Move by Councillor Craddock, second by Councillor Nightingale, opposed, motion carries. That one back.